Good morning, members, and welcome to this morning's meeting of the Health Scrutiny Committee for Lincolnshire. Can we start, please, with agenda item 1, which is election of chairman? Could I ask for nominations, please? Councillor Wootton.
Thank you. I would like to propose Councillor Carl Macy to be chairman. Those of us that have been on this committee for the last 12 months and beyond know that Carl is very conscientious and dedicated to the role of chairman. Not only that, he makes all our health guests very welcome when they come along to present to us. And let's face it, it must be quite daunting to come along, do a presentation, and then have a barrage of questions from people like us. Not only that, Carl always encourages all members to be involved within the committee. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councillor Mrs Wootton. Do we have a seconder for that nomination, please?
Happy to second that, Trina.
Sorry. Are there any further nominations? Right, so the nomination on the table is it's proposed and seconded that Councillor Carl Macy becomes the chairman of the Health Scrutiny Committee for Lincolnshire for 23-24. All those in favour, please raise your hand. Thank you. Those against? Any abstentions? That's carried then. So would you like to come and take the chair, Councillor Macy?
Can I thank both Councillor Linda Wootton and Ray Wootton for my proposal and members of the committee for your support. I look forward to working with you throughout this year and to ensure the best services we can as close to home as possible for our residents and for our area of Lincolnshire as a whole. Thank you. I'd now like to move into introductions by chairman. I would like to welcome everyone who is present in the chamber, including all the newly appointed district council members of this committee. We have Councillors Jyoti Arambath, Margaret Geeney, Jill Makinson-Sanders, Charmaine Morgan, Mrs Diana Rogers, Emily Wood, and also to welcome back to the committee Councillor Rob Kendrick, who has been appointed the County Council vacancy. So welcome. I'd also like to welcome those who are listening online to the business of the Health Scrutiny Committee for Lincolnshire. The recording of the meeting remains on the Council's website after this meeting. I would like to add, for those of us in the Council chamber, there is no fire drill planned this morning. In the event of the fire alarm sounding, we need to leave the Council chamber through the rear doors, through reception, and assemble in the car park at the front of the building and await further instructions. I would also request all members to place their phones on silent and to ensure everyone has the opportunity to ask a question, to ask a maximum of 2 questions per item and to keep these succinct and concise. I think Simon has already covered it with some of the new members, but if you could press the microphone every time you speak, please. And if you'd like to raise a question, please raise your hand and I will note you all down and get round to you as we go along. As the meeting is being streamed in the usual way, I would also like to remind you that your comments will remain accessible online. I'd now like to move to agenda item 2, the election of the Vice Chairman. I would like to nominate Councillor Linda Wootton for Vice Chairman, who has been an excellent support over the last 2 years and who has been an ambassador for Grantham, always ensuring the residents' voices are heard. Do I have a seconder for that proposal, please? Councillor Allen.
Yes, Chairman. Can I second your proposal? Councillor Linda Wootton has done sterling service supporting you as chairman of the committee over the past 12 months and beyond that. So I'm very happy to second your proposal.
Thank you, Councillor Allen. Do I have any further nominations at all, please? No, in which case could I take it to the vote, please? All those in favour, please show. Thank you. That's supported unanimously. Linda, would you like to come up, please? Thank you. Thank you. In which case, we'll now move into agenda item 3, apologies for absence and replacement members. Trina, please.
Thank you, Chairman. We've received apologies for absence from Liz Ball, and we have Tim Stanyland as her replacement today. And we've also had an apology from Councillor Sue Woolley, who's the Executive Portfolio Holder for Community Engagement, Registration and Coroners. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Trina. Do we have any declarations of members next, please? Members' interest, sorry. Councillor Kendrick.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, it's good to be back. Just like to mention that I am now a representative governor from the council to the Board of Governors of LPFT.
Thank you, that's noted. Councillor Morgan.
Thank you. Just to be aware, I am on the ULHT patient panel and also chair of SOS Grantham Hospital. Thank you.
Thank you. Any others? Councillor Arenbath. I would say if you can move the microphones closer to your mouth when you speak, it will pick up better on the YouTube and everything. So thank you. Councillor Arenbath.
My husband works for ULST as a urologist. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's noted down. We now move on to agenda item 5, the minutes from the 17th of May. These can be confirmed as correct on pages 3 to 10 of the agenda pack, and as you've had the opportunity to read these, I plan on taking these on block. Do I have a proposer for these, please? Councillor Allen, thank you, and seconded Councillor Smith. All those in favour, can you please show? Okay. Those abstaining, please show. Thank you. And any against? Thank you. Those minutes are carried. We'll now move on to agenda item 5. I think the numbering's wrong on here. Bear with me. Yeah, it is. Chairman's announcements. My announcements were circulated as part of the agenda, and supplementary announcements were circulated on the 13th of June. I would like to emphasise that the purpose of these announcements is to share information rather than have a detailed discussion. Today, I draw your attention to item 2 in my announcements, in which I propose, as chairman, to send a letter of support to United Lincolnshire's Hospital NHS Trust in the next step in their application to become a university teaching hospital. Do I have a seconder for that, please? Thank you, Councillor Haigh. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. That's supported unanimously. I will now allow for factual questions. Does anyone have any? Councillor Rayworton, please.
Thank you very much, Steve, Mr. Chairman. Can I refer to the Grantham District Urgent Treatment Centre and say thank you to you for accepting my request to have this on the July agenda. There's been such misinformation put around regarding the future of the hospital that it'd be good for us to debate that particular item next in July. The hospital has been temporarily closed overnight since August 2016, which is a long time and a disgrace, really. So at least we know in July what the future holds for us. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Wotton. Any other comments? Yes, Councillor Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In relation to your comment about the minor injuries unit at Stamford, which is in your announcements, I have had very recent correspondence with Nick Blake of the ICB on this, which I would like to quote because it's interesting. I asked him what the direction of travel was with regards to the future of the MIU at Stamford Hospital, and on the 8th of this month, so quite recently, he replied that currently the expectation is that the service remains as is Future needs for Stamford and surrounding area population are being picked up through some work we've started on future health service needs for the area. I don't have a timeline for that work just yet.
Thank you, Councillor Cleaver. I think we'll take a closer look at it at the time. What I would say is there's an element for me, if you can't have your cake and eat it. If we couldn't have a UCC plus in Grantham, then how can we have an MIU? And that is now old terminology. So it's certainly something we will be picking up upon in this committee. Councillor Geeney.
Sorry, but this is on a different matter. I have never received an agenda. I don't know if everyone else has. Do you have any copies? Because I'm not able to follow anything. I don't know whether it's because I'm a new representative, but didn't receive one. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll get a paper copy across to you. There should have been one email. We don't send them out as hard copies any longer, but we'll try and get to the bottom of why you haven't received that, so apologies for that.
Yeah, I didn't. I checked all my emails and I hadn't received one from there either. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Morgan.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Councillor Wotton for bringing forward the importance of the review of the Urgent Treatment Centre, and thank you for accepting that. I would like to add, if it's at all possible, that we also look at we review some of the decisions that have been made and the impacts they're actually having versus what we're being told they could be. We're going to be discussing paediatrics at Boston later. Grantham lost its entire maternity unit. 1,000 babies are born in Grantham a year. So I think it's really important we don't lose sight of that and the impact any decision around maternity services has. As just one example on our community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Morgan. What we can't do as a committee is reopen decisions that have been made. We can only scrutinise decisions that are to be made and then their implementation. So thank you, Councillor Morgan. Any others on the notes? Yep, Councillor Kendrick.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just item 6 on the additional comments. The open day at Peter Hodgkinson Centre. I would encourage members to take up the opportunity to visit. I visited the new centre in my capacity as a governor of the trust and was very impressed with the facilities there. And I think it's an area that everyday people don't get a chance to visit because of the nature of the building. So I would encourage people to take that opportunity up to see what a modern facility looks like in mental health. Thanks, Chairman.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Kendrick. I will be going tomorrow. I think they're having a pre-opening, so I should be going around to have a look then. Any other comments on the Chairman's announcements at this point? No, in which case do I have a proposer that we note these, please? Councillor Wotton and seconded Councillor Haigh. All those in favour, please show. Thank you, they're noted. In which case we'll now move on to agenda item 7, paediatric services at Pilgrim Hospital, Boston. This item was circulated as part of the agenda pack on pages 13 to 22. The consultation document was circulated on the 13th of June. I'd now like to welcome our presenters from United Lincolnshire's Hospital NHS Trust via Teams: Andrew Morgan, Chief Executive, Simon Hallian, Managing Director of Family Health, and Anna Richards, Associate Director of Communication. If I can hand over to you just to have a quick run through. I know that you were here obviously last month, so I'm sure a lot was covered, but if you could, and then we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Chair. Nice to be here again. Congratulations on your reappointment, and to Councillor Wotton, and a huge hello to the new members of your committee. Look forward to working with you very constructively over hopefully many months and years. As you say, Chair, we did go through this very same topic at your committee last month. Since then, we have launched the public consultation. That followed the board meeting of my trust last week. The date of that launch was slightly amended. Our board meeting was last Tuesday. We had a bit more further work to do on the impact assessments that go with any consultation. So the consultation wasn't launched on the 7th. It was launched on Monday the 12th, so Monday this week. Just to reassure you, it will still be a 12-week consultation. So the consultation period is now the 12th of June, right the way through to Monday, the 4th of September. Lots of different ways that people can engage with us during that consultation. I think you have circulated a copy of the survey. We are having in-person meetings, we're having virtual meetings, we are offering to go to meetings of any group that would wish to see us. And as ever, people will also send us their written submissions and we'll get various questions at various times and always do our best to answer those questions. And I think the purpose, as I understand it, of today's topic being on your agenda is for your committee to decide how you want to engage in that consultation and how you wish to pull together your response to it. And as ever, we will be available to help you with that. Any additional information requirements you have, any questions you have, or anything of the like. So what we were not proposing to do, Chair, today is to go back through the slides that I know Simon took us through last time. I think that would just be a repeat of what we probably spent 45 minutes, an hour on last time. But clearly, if there are new questions that have arisen or new information you would like to seek that we can send you, I'm sure if Simon can answer it today, great. If we need to send it on for a future date, that would be no problem. So in effect, consultation launched, and we look forward to 12 weeks of really active engagement with the good people of Lincolnshire on what is, and what has been shown over the last quite a few years now, is a really, really important topic, particularly for the people on the eastern part of the county. So, Chair, if it's okay, I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, in which case I'll open up to questions. Do we have questions, please? Councillor Morgan?
Thank you. On page 5 of our report, and I will apologise because I think this might have been answered at the last meeting, but I wasn't here then. We're told that children who are critically unwell or require intensive care would be transferred to Nottingham. Is that still going to be the case, given you, under your plans, would have more consultants working at Pilgrim? And if so, just could you give us an explanation as to why that is the case, given the distance? It's about an hour and a half to get across the county to get to Nottingham. Thank you.
Shall I answer that, Andrew? Thank you, Councillor. So there are tiers of critical care. So the main intensive care provider is a tertiary provider for each region, and Nottingham is the one that serves us. We couldn't provide the infrastructure required to meet the standards for critical care. We do deliver an HDU level of service to stabilise children at Pilgrim Hospital, and the same at Lincoln, and there is a specialist retrieval team who come with full intensive care expertise and move patients from either of those hospitals into Nottingham if they meet the clinical need to go there. That's the same as you'd find across the NHS. So it is each region will have one or two centres who are set up to provide full critical care support to sick children.
Thank you. Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just for a point of clarity, I think, and something that allows us to consider anything else that happens in the future at the Pilgrim Hospital. The new model is considerably developed beneficially from the one that was put forward, I think, in 2018, and now it seems to me to be almost providing standard childcare facilities for that side of our county. I just wondered what the definition of the new unit is in terms of name or what it actually does has been determined and is quite clear within the consultation document. so that everybody, including the public, understands what it is that now is being talked about and what will be continued to be developed in the future, subject to any further changes and further consultations.
So we are talking to the staff about what to call it. So I think the view is that we would like to give the unit a name in terms of what it actually does. And I'm sort of hoping that as we go through the consultation, this will become very clear to people. It has an inpatient facility, but actually we're not calling it an inpatient ward, even though it does exactly the same function in terms of keeping children there for the entire length of stay they require. Because what we're trying to do is to reflect the ethos that came in after 2018 as we worked through with the staff into 2019 and debated with SOS and Pilgrim and the like, which is really an assessment starting point. So what happens with children and young people who present to Pilgrim now is if they move to the paediatric unit, they are immediately assessed by a very senior team who consultants till 10 o'clock at night in the week, and a very stable nursing force, and they come up with a plan. So that plan, then they can hold patients in to observe them, they can admit them to a normal bedded inpatient facility, and it is that sort of front-end ethos that we're seeing reduced length of stays for Pilgrim. We are seeing patient satisfaction coming through at a very high level, and I think that all hangs on that first bit. So we could revert to calling it an inpatient ward. I think that would slightly dilute the good practice element that went in and that the staff are working so hard on. So we're calling it at the minute, in terms of our working within the division, a paediatric unit. But it does do that full gambit from first attendance, and you can be discharged as soon as assessed, through to inpatient length of stays that can be 3 or 4 weeks if needs be. And that's probably not as succinct an answer as you might be looking for, but it is very much compliant with what the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health have suggested should be the model for general hospitals within the country, with that initial phase being very much driven by early assessment, diagnostic and treatment plan.
Thank you, Chairman. The difficulty I have is that what we've got now is a very enhanced PAU from what was being put forward a long, long time ago, and something that should be promoted and acknowledged and with many thanks for providing this far better service. But to continue to call it a PAU seems to be detrimental to what you're actually providing now. And you know, the original consultation in 2018 about a PAU is nothing to do, it doesn't really reflect what you're doing now in any way at all. So that's why I was suggesting, you know, that a different name with the definitions that go with that different name is something that could be useful, because as you as has happened in terms of, you know, what the history shows us, is that the PAU was developed significantly beneficially from what it was, and we've now got a consultation on what it is, which should be a different sort of consultation on a different form of provision to what was being promoted in 2018, in my view, that is.
And I suppose I'm slightly, clearly haven't got the messaging right, because actually we're not calling it a paediatric assessment unit. We're saying that it is a paediatric unit, an element of which has an assessment function attached to it. But actually, a paediatric assessment unit doesn't have inpatient beds. It doesn't have, it is very much a function about front-end assessment. We had the PAU in 2018, which had a 12-hour maximum length of stay. That's not an unusual kind of model for that debate about an assessment unit. The positive for Pilgrim is we're not calling it a paediatric assessment unit. The numbers of children who are now transferred out of Pilgrim are very, very small. So most children who present there have their full length of stay, everything they need delivered on that hospital site. And actually, we're transferring less people out now than I think we transferred before the change took place in 2018. So I think you're right. We need to find a way of describing that. And our intent is to call it a something paediatric unit, not an assessment unit. This will be a description of a comprehensive paediatric service for a district general hospital, which Pilgrim is.
Any further questions? Councillor Morgan will allow you to come back.
Thank you. Can you just describe,
in view of the fact that, in response to my earlier question, that if the child is critically ill, then they may well end up going to Nottingham. But we clearly have plans to improve the services, which are very welcome at Boston. Can you just explain what the journey would be if a child within the Grantham catchment area, if their parent was to call an emergency ambulance, where would they go? What would the criteria be? Where would they go?
I think, Andrew, you might support me on this. I think the ambulance crew would make an assessment at the point that they attended, and they would take the child to where they decided was the most appropriate place. Some children do go to Grantham still for very minor ailments. The others would be brought to Pilgrim or Lincoln, and in critical cases where they were ill enough to require a tertiary level service, they would be taken directly to Queen's Medical Centre.
Yeah, absolutely.
I shall allow it one more time. Coming back, yeah.
So I'm just clarifying, because you mentioned going to Lincoln, but when we had the maternity changes at Grantham, Boston was one of the hospitals cited for Grantham mums to go to. So can you just clarify? You're saying that actually they wouldn't be sent generally to Boston now. It would be Lincoln or Nottingham rather than Boston.
No, they would take them to the most appropriate hospital. There's full A&E, on-selected A&E for children at Pilgrim Hospital, and they would take them to the place that had the best access at the point that they decided that child needed to move. So we have got an availability for paediatric services to the same level on both the Lincoln site and the Pilgrim site. The ambulance crews are clearly aware of the waiting time in each A&E department at the time they decide which one to go to, and they're aware that we have that ability to take the same level of child onto each of those hospital sites.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Makinson-Sanders, please.
Thank you. Well, we in East Lindsey, we welcome the certainty this is going to bring. There's been a lot of concern about staffing levels, and we went through it in 2018 with lots and lots of debate, and we understand why the situation was like it was. But, you know, we really do support having a good service there, and we should be joining in the consultation. I hope you'll come to East Lindsey and give us a presentation so people are more reassured. It's really important for families if children can be treated as close to home as possible with a good and safe service. And I understand why they have to go further afield, and I think most people are quite prepared to go further afield if they're going to get the right level of service, and it's the right service in the right place at the right time, isn't it? So thank you, and we will be joining in the consultation, which we really do welcome.
That's very helpful, Councillor. Thank you. And we, of course, if there's an invite to come to East Lindsey, I'm in danger of volunteering Simon now to go to a meeting, but I would happily come, and I'm sure Simon and his colleagues would. And we would absolutely endorse your comments about giving certainty both to local residents, but also to our workforce, and also, you know, a clear assurance that, you know, this is about developing a sustainable service, not just for now, but going into the future as part of a thriving Pilgrim Hospital. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no further questions from members of the committee, so I've just got one myself. Have neighbouring health systems been engaged in these proposals, for example, the Humber Acute Services Review Programme?
So we do attend the Humberside Acute Services Review. We've got a meeting, I think, today with them. So we are sharing our plans with them in the same way as they're debating with us what their options are and what the impacts of that might be into Greater Lincolnshire. So yes, we have shared with them. We've spoken previously with other neighbouring trusts to the south of the county, so Kings Lynn and Peterborough. They're aware of the plans as well.
Thank you. Joe, would you like to come back?
Yeah, do you think you could feed that back into your presentation at East Lindsey? Because, excuse me, so many of our patients in the northern part of East Lindsey do go up to the Humber Trust. So it would be important that we knew what was going on up there as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. In which case, I'm going to make a proposal that a response be drafted based on the comments made today and at the last month's meeting and be submitted to the next meeting of this committee for approval. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Hayes. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. Those against? Abstentions? Okay, that's supported then. Thank you. And thank you to our presenters for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
We'll now move on to agenda item 8, if they're here. Simon, are they?
Apologies, Chairman. I've asked the next presenters to come along for 11:15, so apologies that I've misjudged the timings.
Do you want to jump to the work programme?
We can jump to the work programme, perhaps. Yeah, thank you. So, just for the benefit of new members, the committee's forward work programme is included as an item on each agenda at the end of each meeting, and the work programme lists out the items beginning on page 80 of the pack for the meetings from July into the autumn. There are a long list of items for the next meeting, including an update on the acute services review, which has already been mentioned in the earlier discussion, but will be broader and also take on board the other services, orthopaedic services and stroke services, which together with the other two would make the 4 elements of the acute services review. There's also a theme next time with dental and fluoridation, with 2 items, an item on fluoridation, which this committee is going to take forward, given that there is there have been changes to the legislation with more powers in the hands of the Secretary of State. So those are what I mentioned on July. In September, also a long list. I think the item that is the one to highlight there is that cancer care is coming back, because that is an overall look at of all the services where there is pressure on waiting lists. That's probably the one that I suppose the most relevant and important because of its impacts. One of the things that's happening over the next 2 meetings is that we've got the developments in mental health services, which is picking up the activity of the working group, which the committee had in place during last year, and is looking at certain areas of services that the provider trust for mental health services, Lincolnshire Partnership, NHS Foundation Trust. There are a number of new services which they've been implementing, and it's the implementation of these services which needs to be considered so that the committee is fully up to speed with how the additional funding and how this is being used. Perhaps I'll stop there, Chairman, and take questions. Thank you.
Any questions on the work programme, please? Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Chairman. It's for the next committee. We've got an item on, if I can find it now, I've lost it, the Lincolnshire Dental Strategy, with a presentation by the Director of Health Inequalities and Regional Collaboration at the ICB. Can we please see if we can make sure that Sandra Williamson is aware that we're looking at something significant coming out of the strategy? Because I can remember there was a presentation a little while ago in terms of how pharmacy, I think, dentistry and something else was being integrated into the Integrated Care Board, and it didn't seem to deal with the issues that really sit behind it in terms of it's all very well talking about integrating dental care into the ICB, but when it's non-existent, it's a bit meaningless. And if I remember rightly, their prime prong of attack in terms of the inequalities was going around schools giving free toothbrushes away. I would be looking for something more significantly useful and meaningful than that in this presentation at the next committee.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Allen. I'm sure we'll note that down. I mean, that being said, it has only just moved to the Integrated Care Board. I think in April, was it, Simon, it moved across. So there is that little bit of a transition period, but you're absolutely right. To have it more localised, you would certainly hope that we'd have a much more clearer strategy and ways to recruit and retain staff, which is the actual key issue when it comes to dentistry care. So, but Simon, I don't know if you want to come in.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I've noted those comments and I'll make sure. One of the things that I have asked, in addition to, it is for a rundown, for the benefit of new members, of how the dental provision, NHS dental provision, works in Lincolnshire. But there have also been developments in the last 6 months since the NHS presented on this topic with, a closure, which hasn't actually taken place but is due to take place, of a dental practice in Skegness, which has been providing NHS dental services. So I have noted all those comments. Thank you.
So if anyone knows a good dentist, I'm now looking for one. Councillor Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of things based on November being 5 months away. I wonder if we would want to again consider changes to GP services. I know we're doing it today, but I think the issue is so important and such a problem at the moment that we might consider having another relook at it in 5 months' time. And in terms of the introduction of integrated care, I'm uncomfortable with the fact that this committee has so far seen and scrutinised so little about the introduction of integrated care across the county. And I do wonder when it is that we're going to be asked to comment on plans to introduce integrated care at local level.
Thank you, Councillor Cleaver. I'll bring Simon in afterwards. I would say we have got an item on the agenda already today. So, to be fair, we are bringing things forward as they roll out, but it is still bedding in even after all this period of time. Simon.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I mean, one of the items that needs to be programmed into the agenda is a follow-up from the working group on mental health, which is about how mental health provision is provided in GP services. But yes, I think it is a matter for the committee to indicate how, whether they would wish, because I think the updates tend to be around 6 months. So from June, it would, I guess, be December, anyway, so December, November, perhaps. But that's a matter for the committee to consider.
I think my point is that no one's yet said to us, this is how we would like to do it at local level. What do you think, Scrutiny Committee? And that's really my concern.
I think it'd be an excellent question to ask when we've got Pete Burnett here, who is obviously, presenting on the Integrated Care Board today. So I think, that would certainly be one of my questions I would suggest you ask Councillor Cleaver. Okay, I've got Councillor Morgan next.
Thank you. I do have some other ideas about the plan, but currently what strikes me is we're going to be looking at the ASR proposals now, in July for Grantham, and I think that it would make sense to have another review of those further down their path so that we're keeping an eye on what's happening there and what's actually being delivered.
Yeah, absolutely. We do that anyway. And of course, we're now getting to implementation. So there's been an element of, as they begin to course it out, we've been ensuring that we've been, saying we would like an update within 6 months or whatever, and ensuring that that fits with the programme of how or if anything's actually moved or changed. So it's absolutely something that we will continue to ensure is gauged and added to that work programme. Got Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies if this has already been discussed before. I just wondered whether it would be within the scope of the committee to discuss Lincoln County Hospital. So obviously if the plans for Scampton go ahead, it's going to put a severe amount of pressure on the services. I just wondered if there's any plans in place for this.
I think that's probably quite wide. It probably wouldn't just be Lincoln Hospital, in fairness. I think the major impact that potentially it could have on local GPs in that area as well, you know, having to go in and doing the health checks and so on. It's certainly something that I think we can have a discussion on and see how we could try and programme something in, because yes, it will certainly have an impact. So thank you for that. Councillor Rogers.
Thank you, Chairman. The situation we're facing at Scampton, I live in Welton, and I spoke recently with our nurse practitioner and our practice manager, and they are very, very worried about the situation, as is the whole of Welton and Dunholm, and it's going to have a huge impact on health services and on the residents. So, we're waiting to see what happens now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, like I say, we'll pick that up and we'll have a discussion with our colleagues and see how we can try and look at, I think it would be more around the impact that obviously is there around that. So that's something we'll certainly take away and try and look into. Do I have any more comments on the work programme, please? Obviously, I'll bring you in a moment, Councillor Morgan. Obviously, as we move through the agenda today, other items will come out and they will, of course, be added to the work programme as well. Councillor Morgan.
Thank you. It's picking up something that I mentioned during our training and which you said, yeah, it would be worth looking at. And that is the growth, how the growth plans across the county, Scampton would be part of those in a way, how they are impacting on our services and what plans are in place within all of our health service providers, really, to reflect those changes. In particular, we are looking at significant population growth over the next 5 years, 10 years. So, and in fact, even now, in some cases, so how are the, as I said, our NHS bodies and others responding to that? And ideally not responding, but proactively putting things in place.
I think we'll take that away. What I would say is it might actually work better potentially as, not an official meeting and perhaps having a conversation with those ICB members so that we can have an open and frank discussion. And then if a work programme item comes from that, I think it'd be worthwhile, because I think you've probably got nearly a full morning there to discuss how wide that could potentially be. So I think it's something we'll certainly look at. But thank you. Okay, in which case, Simon, is that the EMAS beginning to attend? Okay, so if there's no further comments on the work programme, I'll take it that we're happy. If you could just show all in favour, please. Thank you. Okay, thank you. In which case, we'll now jump back to agenda item 8, the East Midlands Ambulance Service. This item was circulated as part of the agenda pack on pages 23 to 34. The committee considers regular updates from EMAS and recognises the role of the service in supporting the emergency care system. I would like to now welcome our presenters from the Lincolnshire division of EMAS, Sue Cousland, Regional Director, Neil Scott, Service Development Manager, and I'll hand over to you for a quick presentation of around about 10 minutes to 15 minutes, and we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm just waiting for my colleague Neil Scott to arrive. Hopefully he'll be here with us shortly.
That's fine. We're a little ahead of schedule, which is quite rare, but there you go.
Okay, I had just messaged Neil and he said 2 minutes, so he will be with us very shortly. What I intend to do, Councillor Macy, is not refer to the presentation. The presentation is there, but does duplicate what's in the report. So Neil and I are going to walk just through the salient points of the report. I'm going to do sections 1 and 2. Neil's going to do 3 and 4, and I'm going to complete the rest of the report, if that's okay.
That'll be fine, thank you.
Lovely. I'll continue whilst we're just waiting for, it looks as if Neil's coming in now. Yes. Morning, Neil. I've just outlined to the committee that we'll be going through the report as opposed to the presentation. So Good morning, everybody. Unfortunately, I can't see anybody, but we will carry on and are happy to take questions throughout our discussion as required. As Councillor Macy has said, I'm Sue Cousland. I'm Divisional Director for the Lincolnshire Division of EMAS, and Neil is one of the heads of operations within the division. So we last came to see you in October last year, where you raised some significant concerns around the division's ability to perform to national standards, to actually improve the ability to improve hospital handover times, to sustain sufficient levels of recruitment, particularly related to qualified staff, and to retain those experienced members of staff within our workforce. So what we've endeavoured to do with this report is to try to present the facts as they are currently. So that is for April and May of this year, where we are starting to show some improvements, but also to give you a flavour of Q3 and Q4, which were extremely challenging for a number of reasons, not just for Lincolnshire Division, but I think for the whole system in Lincolnshire. So I'll hand over to Neil to take us through sections 3 and 4. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. As Sue said, I'm Neil Scott. I'm Head of Operations for Lincolnshire Division within EMAS. So just moving on to the report then, I'm just going to walk through the next sections on that. So we're at page 2 and the performance section. So the focus throughout this report has been Category 1 and Category 2 calls. Now, just as a reminder, these are effectively imminent life-threatening calls, which are Category 1s where life is at risk, and Category 2 emergencies where there's a potential for life or serious injury to be at risk to a lesser degree. And Category 2 calls make up between 65 and 70%. It's a fluctuating figure of our activity. So looking at that Category 2 position is a good measure and a good metric of how we're performing as an organisation in our response to the people of Lincolnshire and the people of the East Midlands. On that bottom section of page 2, significantly with the Category 2, you can see what that performance has done. Now, I know when we last spoke in October, we were looking retrospectively over the tail end of COVID and what had come before, and those performance figures were shockingly high. But as you look across what happened in December that's just gone, the winter we've just had, it really did reach exceptional levels of delay. And that December position shows that where we jumped from a C2 mean position sitting around the 1 hour, 1 hour 30 up to nearly 3 hours. And that was really significantly felt, not just for the patients and the people of the country requiring an ambulance response, but of course across our workforce as well, who are, coming to work every day wanting to do the best for their patients and struggling to do it when things are that pressurized. I'm going to come on to that change as we've moved into this current financial year, but I'm just going to talk a bit about what that Q3 and 4 positions looked like. So for an ambulance service, and Lincolnshire's not really any different to any other ambulance service in the country, it's effectively a fine balance. It's a fine balance between operational outputs, so ambulances in effect, and meeting patient demand by responding to those. And it's anything that interferes with that, so anything that interferes with operational output hours, anything that interferes with available ambulances, clearly has a detrimental effect on performance, and as you take that further down, on patient outcome and patient experience. However, what we have found in Lincolnshire is, regardless of what activity is doing, with how pressured we are with incidents coming in with 999 activity, what we have been able to maintain, even through real difficult periods like December just gone, is a control of that through our really good non-conveyance. And by non-conveyance, what I mean is dealing with patients and protecting our busy A&E departments, protecting our acute hospitals by not taking patients there and doing something else with them. And the primary things we do with those patients when we're not conveying them to hospital department is something called hear and treat and see and treat. Hear and treat being clinical advice over the phone, see and treat being when we discharge or refer someone face-to-face in their home or in a public setting. And as figure 4 shows there on page 3, our emergency department conveyance through what we do with hear and treat and see and treat has maintained us in that really strong position of protecting acute services, protecting the acute hospitals across Lincolnshire. And we've been at or under the EMAS position and at or under the national position in terms of what that conveyance looks like. Just moving on to the next section in terms of what I was saying about that balancing act between you only deliver good performance, you only deliver ambulance service when you've got the resource to do it. And figure 5 on page 4 is a national position, but it gives a good flavour of what the ambulance service nationally has been up against, where we look at a pre-COVID, in effect, position where 4% of our capacity was lost to lost hours, taking us through to April 23. And you can see what that's done in terms of that red area has increased and grown over time. And when you transpose that into Lincolnshire, with hospital delays and lost hours, it's felt even more so with being a rural and geographically difficult place as well. So lost hours is more impactful in rural communities. What you can see in figure 6, which is our outputs, as I said, that balancing act, that seesaw of outputs, is we've maintained at or close to 100% of what our resourcing output should be over quarter 3 and 4. But we've had that step change in April and May of this financial year where we've been able to increase our operational outputs and as such improve performance accordingly, which I'll come on to. But we've had that real step changes. We've moved into the new financial year through putting out more resource to better serve the people of Lincolnshire. The hospital delay position on page 5 starts off with giving a national flavour of the trends. And I would just say pay attention to those trend lines because you can see that reflected later on in the Lincolnshire graphs as well. What that shows through the COVID sections in yellow into where we are now and through the winter we've just been is that real significant growth in hospital handovers and associated projected harm that patients have experienced nationally through those delayed hours and subsequent delayed responses. And you can certainly see when you move on to figure 9, which is handovers over 30 minutes, that trend line is significant, and that peak in December really exemplifies how pressured and how difficult winter has just been for us, but with an improving picture absolutely coming out of it. Page 7 brings it into a local context. So what page 7 shows in figure 10 and figure 11 is as a division, as Lincolnshire, what we've experienced as lost hours from handover delays, and figure 11 shows it with a ULHT specific focus. And just to invoke some corporate memory, with figure 11, when I think to pre-COVID times, we would get very anxious if we were losing somewhere in the region of 1,000 to 1,500 hours a month. That was a bad period. That was a challenge for us. And then when you look at the winter just gone, November, December time, we were approaching for nigh on 10,000 hours lost, which just shows that huge shift in pressure. And while that's there wasn't vast amounts of resource backfilling that. So we really were up against it in the winter just gone. However, it is not all bad news. It very much is not all bad news. And as we've moved from winter into quarter 4 into this new financial year, we've had a decrease in hospital handover delays. We've had an improvement in our absence rate and our staff sickness and general absence, which of course is intrinsically linked. It's performance versus absence versus the job that you're doing is all closely linked, and we've seen that real improvement in staff well-being and in staff morale as we've come out of winter into this new year. We've been able to increase our resource significantly in April into May due to an increase in private resource, which sits alongside our plan to increase our core workforce with recruitment retention plans, which Stu's going to come on to later in this discussion. Page 8 for me really exemplifies the improvements we've seen. So figure 12 is our regional position. We're marked, of course, as a regional provider and what our regional performance is. And the current national target for this financial year we're currently in is for all ambulance services nationally to be under a mean time for category 2 calls to be under 30 minutes. And as you can see from figure 12, we're certainly getting towards that position with periods very close to or under that 30-minute mean position. And the really exciting one for me is figure 13, in that Lincolnshire has always been and will always be a difficult one to hit performance at, with its geography and with its population spread and everything that makes Lincolnshire the great place we all live. It will always be a challenge to meet a high-speed performance time on. But you can really see in figure 13 there that the improvements we've had in hospital handover position, the improvements we've had with operational outputs, the extra resource where we've gone from 98, 99% requirement up to 100, 110, 115% has had that marked difference in C2 performance. And we're really coming down to much more reasonable levels of delivery. But I'll let Sue come on to some of the background as to why that is and what we're doing in the future and what the future looks like.
Thank you, Neil. Moving on in the paper to page 9, section 5, which is around quality initiatives. As we've spoken to you before, we have as a trust undergone a restructure of our management team. In Lincolnshire, we implemented that in November 2021. Since then, we've carried out a review with our regional colleagues, and I'm delighted to say as a result of that, we will be appointing 2 additional station managers to manage our 17 stations. And we're also looking to have 2 development posts of duty commander. So the duty commander role is that role that covers the county 24/7 and responds to any major incident, such as the one that EMAS dealt with yesterday, sadly. We have also appointed to the vacant position of Divisional Senior Manager for Quality. And again, we have been very fortunate in appointing a candidate from Yorkshire Ambulance who is extremely experienced, and he starts with us a week on Monday on the 26th of June. Moving on to efficiency and effectiveness initiatives. We have actually now also shortlisted, I've done that this morning, for the 3rd pathway lead role in Lincolnshire. This is a unique role to EMAS. We're delighted to say we have 2 people already in post who are working very hard with system colleagues to look at alternative pathways that are more suitable clinically for patients rather than attending an emergency department. So we will be interviewing for that role. We had 9 candidates, so a really good field. We've shortlisted 5, and again, interesting to see and very pleasing to see people wanting to come back and are reapplying to come back to work for EMAS. So those interviews will take place on the 27th of June. We have also been extremely fortunate to receive some additional funding from the ICB, and that's to fund 2 teams of 3 clinical navigators. So these are experienced nurses and paramedics who stand at the front end of our emergency departments at both Lincoln County and Pilgrim, 7 days a week during the peak period. They are there to help turn around the ambulances as quickly as possible, work with our acute colleagues to improve that interface in the emergency department, to identify those patients who perhaps don't need an emergency department, but may need some other department in the hospital. And also they look out into the community for those patients who are either waiting for an ambulance or have got an ambulance on scene, and they will be discussing with colleagues on the most appropriate options for those patients. Very early days, but already starting to see some really improved working relationships and improved outcomes for patients, which is the most important thing. And again, that is a first for EMAS, and looking to other divisions now to employ similar posts across the region. So we're very proud of that particular initiative. Another area that we're extremely proud of are our clinical leaders. We have 12 of them in Lincolnshire. Sounds a lot, but when you consider the size of the whole county and the 24-hour cycle that we try to cover, 12 does not go very far. We have 6 senior positions, 6 associate positions who are development posts and are very keenly sought after. And I have to say, we are extremely fortunate with the clinical calibre of those individuals. So much so, we nominated them for the initiatives, the training initiatives and the mentorship initiatives that they are giving our staff in Lincolnshire. They do have something called professional support and learning. So that's a whole programme of events programmed throughout the year that staff are able to attend in their own time, and we do support them with that by giving them time back. We do encourage learning because we appreciate how difficult it is when people are actually at work to do so. That incorporates a level of clinical supervision as well for staff, and that has been extremely well received to the point where we did nominate for a regional event, and I'm delighted to say the team in Lincolnshire won that particular category. We are now moving forward to nominate them for a national award, such as the strength of the training that they deliver. We have also, again, been trialling in Lincolnshire initiative around wound care management. So this is for particularly vulnerable elderly patients who may have fallen, who may have got a skin tear that previously they would have had to have been transported to an emergency department or a minor injury unit for treatment. They are now receiving treatment by our technicians and our paramedics at home, wound care treatment that is then followed up by community services a few days later, which means that we no longer have to transport those patients to hospital. That initiative is being rolled out across the organisation as part of the Sequin initiative, which is Commissioning for Quality and Innovation. So it is our local Sequin for last year and this year to roll that training out across the entire region. I'm moving on to page 10 now. At the top of page 10, Category 2 segmentation is something that has recently been implemented in EMAS and across all national ambulance trusts, following a pilot in London Ambulance and West Midlands. This is where Category 2 patients are looked at with an additional level of triage to see whether they are indeed a Category 2 patient or whether an alternative option might be more viable for them. In the trials, this has demonstrated that a reduced amount of ambulance conveyance was required, and patients often were receiving a more appropriate form of treatment. We are in very early stages of this particular initiative, and we are currently recruiting to senior posts who sit within our operations centre in both Nottingham and Lincoln. But in the early small numbers of people who are re-triaged on a daily basis, roughly 30% of them do not then need to have an ambulance deployed. We find alternative options for them that are clinically safe and suitable for their particular presentation. Recruitment and retention is something I know that we are very concerned about, and you echoed those concerns when we last came to see you. So the organisation is currently defining its clinical strategy, which will incorporate a clinical operating model. So what is it that we will be doing as an ambulance service for urgent and emergency care? Within there, we are building in an internal skills escalator. So with a very real pathway where individuals can join us and work through and progress to become quite senior clinicians in the organisation. We have included for you the table, which is figure 14, that actually gives you a breakdown for Lincolnshire of the top box, the operational skill mix, which is qualified versus unqualified. So in the qualified section, that is paramedics, specialist paramedics and technicians versus our emergency care and urgent care staff. And the bottom box is the registered versus unregistered. And that quite simply means the paramedics and nurses who are registered with regulatory bodies. As you can see, that figure in that lower box for March, we only have a third of the staff currently out on our ambulances who have a qualification that needs registration. That gives significant concern because of the level of expertise that we have out in Lincolnshire, and we're working really hard to change and improve that skill mix. We also have included a table 15, that actually demonstrates the attrition rate. Again, we were raising concerns around quite a high attrition rate. I'm pleased to say that whilst it has slowed down, we're still concerned about it, but it has slowed down, particularly in the early part of this year. We are not seeing as many people leaving as we have previously. But obviously, it is a very real focus for the division. Rich Hunter and myself are going into Lincoln University next week to talk to newly qualified technicians who may wish to come and work in Lincolnshire, and we're hoping to be able to persuade a number of them to do so. Over on page 11, figure 16 shows we've just put that in there to show you the recruitment plan for Lincolnshire and what is planned. Those tall blue boxes are the number of additional recruits that we are anticipating being able to appoint over the coming months. As you can see, in May, the appointment, particularly of our ambulance support crew role, did not meet the target. However, we are looking at different ways of recruitment and different skill set of recruitment, and we have an open advert for both paramedics and technicians on a rolling programme for most of the year. We are also delighted again, Lincolnshire is being used very much as a test bed for a number of initiatives. I think with the theory is that if it will work in Lincolnshire, it will work just about anywhere, but also we have a very enthusiastic senior team who are keen to try just about anything. So we will be going out to internal advert for a development role of specialist practitioner. So this is a senior paramedic, as we've described before, and we have not been able to recruit to that role, mainly because people did not have the academic qualification. We do in Lincolnshire have a wide number of people, or a large number of people, who absolutely meet the experience criteria but don't have the academic qualification. So we are introducing, just for Lincolnshire candidates, an opportunity to train on the job and then take up a specialist paramedic role at the end of it. So that will be going out in June, July, with a start date of September this year. We're also looking at additional roles of advanced practitioner and also nurses on ambulances. And as a nurse myself, something that I'm very keen to see, an additional skill set that I think will absolutely complement the skill set of the existing ambulance personnel. Again, we have put ourselves forward and in principle have been given approval around the ambulance nurse role. But we've yet to determine the timelines for recruitment to that role. Staff engagement is really key. I think Neil's already touched on it in terms of workforce. We've put a lot of effort over the last year, and particularly supported by the new management structure, and indeed the station manager role is proving invaluable in this area. We've introduced what we call chatty cafes. So regionally, there is something called a conversation cafe that comes to Lincolnshire with executive team members twice a year. What we're doing is we're supplementing that with our own local chatty cafes where we go out, provide drinks for staff. Used to be on station. We don't find staff on stations anymore. So we go to our local emergency departments and we actually do engage with our emergency department colleagues as well. We have no agenda when we go out. It's staff's opportunity to meet with, see and talk to a range of senior staff and within the division. And so far they are proving to be quite popular, with a very wide range of topics discussed, with a very low level of negativity with quite a lot of positivity, and I have to say a lot of ideas coming from staff for things that we might wish to consider trying in the future. All of that is taken forward through the station manager function, so we're able to feed back. That's also supplemented by station meetings and something that we call station voice. We have nominated people on each station who are nominated by their peers to be the voice for them on their station. So they have a channel, communication channel, which is very informal through to all members of staff, senior members of staff, and the station meetings happen on a regular basis. What's really interesting is when the turnout is low, and when we've asked why the turnout is low for some of these station meetings, staff have said they haven't really got anything particular to discuss and they have no particular concerns at the moment, which is quite a positive feedback to receive, because usually if staff wish to voice a concern, they will come straight to us to do so. So that is a roundup, and in summary, on page 12, we have just put some headlines around future plans and investments. So you may have heard that nationally, ambulance trusts are getting a separate funding stream. We believe that figure for EMAS to be around £23 million in 23-24, and that is predominantly aimed at the national Category 2 30-minute achievement target. So we are working through regionally with colleagues. We understand that Lincolnshire will be a significant beneficiary of that funding, particularly around workforce establishment and expansion. We're looking to have greater engagement with lives and our commissioners around some of the activities, both commissioned and non-commissioned. So we're looking at the community emergency medical response and also falls. Neil has done a terrific amount of work with our fire and rescue colleagues on refining the community medical response model from fire and rescue colleagues, and we're hoping to be able to expand that to help with the performance targets, particularly for Category 1 and possibly Category 2 patients. We're describing to you a workforce plan that is coming together that is very different for Lincolnshire in recognition, I think, of our fairly unique and significant challenges that we have. And that has taken some time for us to be able to demonstrate some of the really unique challenges that we have. And hopefully I've been able to articulate those new roles very clearly and the importance that they will have on our performance and our ability to provide high quality care across Lincolnshire in the future. So, Councillor Macy, that concludes our report. I'm happy to take any queries or questions.
Yes, thank you very much for that very in-depth report. So I will open up to questions now. I'll start with Councillor Ray-Wotton, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Chairman. First of all, Sue, can I praise your team, praise all members of the East Midlands Ambulance Service for their dedication and their hard work doing a difficult role serving the community. I'm concerned, though, on the handover times on your figure 7 and figure 8. Can you tell me if those handover times, which have increased, are due to industrial action at hospitals or within the staff yourself? Thank you.
Thank you. Neil, are you happy to pick up?
Yes, certainly. So figure 7 and 8 is the national position. That's what's been happening with ambulance services nationally. However, looking at figure 10 and 11, while industrial action inherently will have had an impact, the vast majority root cause of handover delays, not just Lincolnshire, but regionally, nationally, is down to flow of patients through the entire healthcare and social care system. It very much, as that is portrayed in the media, is on the mark in terms of how it is in reality. There's a higher acuity of patient that is using ambulance services and A&E services over what would be a traditional route, be that GP, be that community urgent care, be that community services. There's a lot of defaulting to emergency care rather than urgent care, which is creating pressure. But certainly the vast reason, the majority reason of handover delay is flow through the entire patient journey from the I initially feel ill right through to the I'm being discharged out of a hospital bed into social care, or I'm in social care and I'm needing to be discharged from social care into my home, my community, etc. And it's that entire flow piece that is the bottlenecks that drives it.
So, Chairman,
Thank you, Neil.
Neil, can I ask then, what plans have you got in place to liaise with the hospitals to make sure these handovers do proceed smoothly, more smoothly in the future?
Certainly. So we do things both remotely and in person. So on a daily basis, we have multiple calls through the day with our various systems, not just Lincolnshire, but also North and North East Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, because of course they use Lincolnshire ambulance resources to effectively spell out what our risks, pressures, resourcing activities looking like, so we can all mitigate those as best we can collectively. There is no one agency that's going to ever solve that on a given day. It's a team effort and a team position, and shared understanding of that risk is one of the key things we do. By shared understanding of risk, what I mean by that is the acute hospitals in Lincolnshire could be having a fantastic day. EMAS is not having a good day. So them understanding the risk that we're holding, and yesterday is a prime example of that when we had a major incident in Nottingham, we immediately called upon our acute colleagues in Lincolnshire and beyond to say we need to immediately release resources because we're going to need a large influx of resources into Nottinghamshire to offset risk. Now that's an extreme example, but if, for example, we're having delays in Grimsby or Scunthorpe hospitals, that's going to potentially affect the people of upper NHS Lincolnshire, by communicating that shared risk and sharing that risk, then actions can be taken by other partners that they ordinarily wouldn't take because they're not feeling it, but as a collective, we are feeling it. And so it's that team approach that does it. From a face-to-face point of view, one of the driving reasons behind the clinical navigators that we put in that are at the front door of A&E at Lincoln and Boston, and that was a joint appointment. One of the prime reasons we did that was to enhance that communication piece so that they can have that direct face-to-face conversation with the nurse in charge of the emergency department, with the overall site manager for the whole hospital, and have that global holistic picture, and we can all work better because of it.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Neil. Nothing detracts from my initial comments, my praise for the staff. Thank you very much indeed, to all your staff.
And Councillor Wootton, I will certainly take that back, and that will be extremely well received, that recognition. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. Similarly, as Councillor Wootton's alluded to, I'd like to pay tribute to everything that you do. I know it's a very difficult job and it's not easy, especially around the reduction in Category 2 times, as I know when you were here last time across the chamber, and especially from myself, you got a bit of a grilling on that because it impacts a number of residents, and especially quite a number of mine who are very rural in nature. Is there anything you don't have in an ideal world, in a world where money is, shall I say, more plentiful? In an ideal world, is there anything you don't have that you think you need, or is there a situation like the handover bottleneck that causes these delays? And secondly, what can be done during the winter period to keep the average times to a similar level as they are now? Because the one worry I do have, Chairman, is winter comes and we're back to the similar position as we were a couple of months ago, Chairman. With your indulgence, Chairman, just a third question. It's very brief. Neil, could you sort of expand on what you mean by you have private assets engaged and what that means for the service as a whole? Because I think that'd be very useful. Thank you.
If you're happy, I'll answer that in reverse order, just because it's fresh in my head. So in essence, the plan that Sue has described in terms of what our growth plan is for recruitment is in part driven by the further investment that we're due to receive or are about to receive. However, of course, that takes time. And having that come through doesn't give you instantaneous results. So part of our strategy, and this is our regional strategy, and linked in with what other ambulance trusts are doing as well, is backfilling with private resource while we're growing that workforce. Because of course what we want is an embedded workforce, a Lincolnshire workforce with people from Lincolnshire where it's their communities that they're serving, because that gives you that long-term stability and it gives you that family feel. You know, in reality, an ambulance service is one big green family, and what we want is that embedded Lincolnshire residents, Lincolnshire staff serving the people of Lincolnshire. That's the goal. But the reality is it takes time to build that, even with investment. Nothing's overnight. So what we're doing is we're upping our private resource in the short term while we're building that in the background. And in numerical terms, effectively what we have done is we're doubling our private resource, or trying to double our private resource to provide that offset and that resource boost. Because as I said, it's a seesaw of resource output hours versus lost hours. And we're just trying to bolster that in the short term. And that's effectively what you can see. That's one part of the improvement that you can see when you go in from March into April. I think the second question you had was with regards to the concerns over winter. Equally, I 100% share those same concerns. Winter in the NHS, in any part of the NHS, is always a challenge. I think that what we saw in the winter just gone certainly was a shock to all of us in terms of what that felt like, what that impact was. And with the extra headroom that we've had with regards to this extra investment and the change that we're seeing now, that extra headroom we're using and that extra capacity we're using to do a lot of the side actions, such as the pathways work, the non-conveyance work, the ambulance nurses, the advanced practitioners, all of that builds that richness of the means to delivery is never just send an ambulance, but having that headroom and capacity and performance capacity to be able to build that side issues and that support network around is all part of that risk mitigation as we head into winter. But of course, as I said earlier, it's never going to be a single agency solution to it. It's a multi-agency, multi-provider solution that's going to get us through winter in a safe measure. What I would say is one final point, though, is of course, as I alluded to in my presentation, Lincolnshire will always be a challenge with a short time-based response, be that police, fire, ambulance, whatever, because of the geography and the nature. But it's producing a solution that is incumbent of that and in recognition of that is the real key to delivering the right thing for the people of Lincolnshire.
I wonder if I could just add into that, particularly from a winter perspective, Councillor Smith, and I think this is where the beauty of a cohesive system engagement and working relationship really does pay dividends, because we are already starting to plan for an expected spike in respiratory condition, in particular in November. We work with our public health colleagues who have very accurate surveillance data that we are able to use as a system. So we will be looking at our virtual ward capacity for respiratory patients as a system of which, as ambulance personnel, we have direct access to. So there is a lot of work going on and a lot of learning being taken from last year in particular, where the spike was predicted, but it was much, much higher than anticipated. And I think there is a role for all of us in Lincolnshire in particular to actually play with the residents in order to try to ensure that people are aware of what service they need to be accessing at what level, so that it actually helps everybody try to manage that surge in demand.
Thank you, Chairman. I think you've inadvertently hit the nail on the head. The problem, which is actually why you get called probably when you shouldn't, is access to other services. Because I'll use my example, case in point, I had an issue and then COVID hit, and it got to a point, 6 months, finally saw somebody, oh, can you do a same-day appointment at Lincoln County Hospital? You could have a problem. Yeah, okay, didn't need ambulance, thankfully. But that's why, unfortunately, especially during winter, I think that's why it's so difficult, because there's more problems anyway during winter for you as EMAS. But then you also have residents who are struggling to access other services before they need to call you, which is why you get called when actually in certain circumstances you shouldn't have to answer that call. I know that's not something you can fix. That's probably something for a later agenda item, Chairman, but I think it's important to state that as you're doing everything you can do, it's actually other parts of the system that are pulling against what you're trying to do, and we will do what we can, but I think it's important to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think they picked up on the private ambulance part that you are actually touched upon either, because I think you mentioned the fact of the private provision that's at section 3.5 of the report, and I don't think that was covered.
It was, Chairman. They did touch on that. That it wasn't private ambulance, but it was the private provision and the private assets they were using, not specifically around ambulances, but it was picked up. But thank you for checking.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I've now got Councillor Parkin. I will just say I've got a list of 5 speakers, and I'm going to close the debate down at that point because I'm conscious of time. So Councillor Parkin first.
Really helpful. I'm too used to standing in front of a lectern that I don't need to press now, I think. We have obviously praised the staff, quite rightly so. And I do want to draw attention to what happened yesterday in those tragic circumstances in Nottingham. And again, just reiterate how it takes a special kind of person to go towards that kind of incident rather than run away from it. And I think all of us in the chamber owe the staff a debt of gratitude, particularly after an event like this. It's a very salutary reminder of the risks that they take upon themselves, and also the amount of emotional impact and trauma that they potentially expose themselves to. And we certainly wish all of them well and commend the staff for yesterday. A couple of points have already come up actually. Already, I was very interested in the Lincolnshire recruitment and recruiting our own, and I think that's been addressed, but one I think that we need to keep a handle of going forward. I'd be really interested to know the next update in terms of the present round of recruitment, how many people we did manage to recruit that way, or whether we're still bringing people from there. And if we are, we are. But it would be really nice to see, does that change at some point? Does that picture improve about the local recruitment? The other thing that I'm really interested in is, again, some of it is being addressed by what we've just... If you think of being able to predict and public health predictions in terms of respiratory diseases, which we have just heard about, I'm interested in terms of whether EMAS think then that the other side of public health in terms of vaccinations and all the rest of it are working as well as they can do to actually try and prevent that peak, or whether there is more to do with that kind of synergy between those different parts of the system that needs tinkering with. So is all of that smooth? Is all of that coherent? Or is there something that needs to be tinkered with elsewhere to help relieve those winter pressures?
I think you're right. I think, but our public health colleagues would be the experts to answer that question. We don't retrospectively review in detail that amount of detail, if that makes sense, Councillor Parkin. That we leave to the experts within the system, but we do work really closely, particularly with public health colleagues, and we actually use a 5-year activity predictor model in EMAS, and that has proved to be extremely accurate in pinpointing areas of high activity based on historical practice. So I don't know whether that helps, but certainly that element that you're talking about probably wouldn't fall within our remit or expertise.
I think that's a point I'd be really interested in, because you've mentioned November as being where you're predicting that increase and it sounds like you're relatively confident in that modelling. And so therefore, I think there's a question potentially for us back to public health in terms of if we know that that's coming in November, at what point is that publicity and at what point is that vaccination campaign starting? Because if it's October, it's probably too late. So I don't know if there's a way that we can get into the system to ask that question, Carl.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly happy to bounce that across, and we'll try and get that information in. So that'll be good. Thank you. Now got Councillor Kendrick.
Thanks, Chairman. First a question followed by a comment. I was particularly interested in the new 6 clinical navigators, and I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about how they work alongside the triage nurses, both for physical health and also the mental health nurses that are in A&E. I just wonder if I could just have a little bit more information about their role in connection with those. And secondly, my comment is I was particularly interested in the chatty cafe thing, because I think in a large organisation such as the NHS and particularly EMAS, having the opportunity for people in the front line to communicate issues and concerns with senior management, I think is a great idea, and I really welcome that. I think it's fantastic. But if you could just give me some information about the clinical navigators, that'd be great. Thanks, Chairman.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And I would echo the chatty cafes, because certainly the feedback that we're getting is really positive out of that. So the clinical navigation function is a new role. It is a jointly appointed role, as Neil has said, between ourselves and ULHT. So we work with both sets of managers. So the staff that we have in those positions are a combination of paramedics and nurses who have a wealth of experience, not just in the ambulance service, but outside of that. So they work with probably the greatest interface of other personnel. So they work not only with emergency department colleagues, particularly the physician in charge of the emergency department, particularly when they have identified more poorly patients that are either coming in or have arrived that need more immediate attention. So there's that immediacy that is really helpful. There are also the links through to other departments within ULHT, within the medical directorate, such as same-day emergency care. And we're doing a lot of work with diagnostics and radiology in terms of the potential, if we have somebody, say, for example, an elderly person who may have a fractured neck of femur, to go straight through to X-ray. We know there are pathways in other parts of the country that do that bypass emergency department and take people straight through. So their role is identifying where there might be the opportunities to put new pathways in. And by having a joint appointment and joint managerial oversight, that actually is starting to prove quite beneficial in terms of moving ideas on into implementation. One of the biggest areas, though, I think, is that pre-hospital piece. So they have the technology to be able to review patients waiting in the system and ambulances that are on scene, particularly at care homes, and are able to through the radio system that we have, they're able to contact crews and talk to them directly about what might be the most appropriate outcome for those patients, which sometimes is not a transfer to an acute hospital emergency department. So it's very much an evolving role. We've linked it very closely with our pathway leads. They work with the clinical navigators as well, and the 2 pathway leads were in Boston ED yesterday, working with our nurse, Bev Hill, who is the clinical navigator there. So they're looking at what those pathways could look like. And then they are all managed by our new divisional senior manager for quality. So we're looking at quality patient outcomes all the time. I hope that gives you a little bit more information, but it is work in progress. So hopefully at our next visit, we'll be able to give some more detailed update and information about their outputs.
Thanks very much. You actually answered the question I was going to ask, was if we could have an update on how it's progressing, because it sounds a very innovative idea, and it'll be interesting to see the progress on that. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Kendrick. I've got Councillor Allen next, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Kendrick almost asked my question for me, but not quite, so I'll carry on with it. I'd just like to ask a couple of questions in relation to the background that you provided, because the information has been very, very useful, but it does show that response time performance has not been particularly good. It's getting a lot better very recently, and I think that's really what I was trying to concentrate on there in terms of trying to find out what that might be. Also to bear in mind some of the other comments that have been made about Lincolnshire having its own particular problems. Well, they're well known. We're a big council. The area hasn't changed, and the issues haven't changed either. We always have issues in winter because winter's winter. So these are not new things, and they should really be taken into account in terms of the delivery of performance and delivery of healthcare to the population of the UK and certainly Lincolnshire. I'm also quite sympathetic to EMAS because I'm well aware that whatever the challenges are within the health system, particularly with NHS, it's going to have some knock-on effects in terms of how EMAS performs and its ability to do its job within the overall delivery of the healthcare that we require. The two particular questions, and against that background, are twofold. And I'd like to go to figure 50, I think it was figure, if I can just find it, Chairman, which I found particularly interesting, and it's the one that shows a step change. So it's figure 13, and it shows a step change that took place in April 2023, which is quite a significant step change. And I have an engineering background, so anything that has a step change like that always it doesn't concern me, it doesn't worry me, but it always looks as though something ought to, some additional investigation ought to take place to find out exactly what that is, and particularly when it's possibly as a consequence of various initiatives and innovations that have been put into the system, rather than simply, for instance, changing target levels, because there will be another step change if we're changing target levels from 18 minutes or whatever it is to 30 minutes as well. And we really want to identify the ones that are genuinely improving things rather than just targets that are becoming easier to meet. So I wondered whether anything's been done in terms of actually trying to work through the changes that have taken place around that sort of period to find out what is having a significant effect. It does say there's been a combination of things because it's increased resources, decreased sickness, and handover times, obviously, which affect everything. And I did wonder whether it was the clinical navigators that have been brought into play that are starting to have a significant change, because, as Councillor Kendrick said, it is an innovation, and you can see the merits of it in terms of actually improving throughput through the system, and indeed removing some of the issues associated with handover at A&E, for instance, if you can put them directly into the system without going through an A&E. And anything that gets people out of the ambulances quicker must be beneficial to EMAS and the service that it provides. So I was wondering whether that is something that's been done or is something that would be done, because I think it's quite important to find out what that step change, what sits behind that step change. And the other point, the other question I've got is to do with the innovations that are taking place, quite rightly, to try and ensure that you don't take people to hospital if you don't need to. If you can get to home and find out there's treatments that can be carried out there, there's no point in taking them into hospital at that particular time, and it may be then better for the ambulance to go off and do something far more important. But it does, but that does require having the right skills in the ambulance to actually do those sorts of things. And I was a little bit concerned about figure 14, and it was referred to in the presentation, about having the right skill mix to actually do all those sorts of things. And if we're moving more and more in that direction, it does strike me that we ought to be putting more and more skills into the ambulance and more training into the people so they can do that. Is that something that is planned and is taking place? Because at the moment it doesn't seem as though it's increasing significantly as skill match.
Thank you for that, Councillor Allen. I wonder, I'll pick up that point and I'll ask Neil to pick up the point around the step change, if that's okay. So in terms of the skill mix, you're absolutely right. And that's why I've drawn attention to the skill mix issues within division, as well as our clinical navigators, and they are having some impact upon that step change that you're talking about, but not to that level of degree, because they're only really recently new in post. So their impact is not yet, I would suggest, being fully felt. What we also are doing is we have what we call duty commanders, who again are experienced paramedics. We have 4 on for every 12-hour shift right the way through the whole period. They also, as well as attending incidents and managing incidents, we nominate one of them to have oversight of what we call call cycle. So you will see in figure 12 where we've got 2 columns in there to the right, on-scene time conveyed and on-scene time non-conveyed. So we're spending an inordinate or an extended period of time on scene if we know we don't need to take somebody to a hospital, but what else do we need to be able to put into place to keep them safe and leave them at home, or get somebody else in to assess them? So it's that bit. So when we've got people who've been on scene for a certain length of time, again, through the radio system, they receive a call to ask if everything's okay and whether they can provide any additional assistance. So that's our mitigation around our skill mix issue at the moment. So there is always somebody with an oversight of all of the jobs that are happening in Lincolnshire, with that ability to chip in and help and provide additional support remotely, but also can mobilise to provide additional support if required. That intelligence then is absolutely key and helps us feed back into the ICB through our pathway leads and other ways of actually what else might be required to help support a more efficient transfer of care from ourselves to another provider. So I hope that helps expand on the concern around skill mix.
And just to follow on with that in regards to the step change question, so I go back to my seesaw analogy in terms of with a metric of performance time, where effectively you're measuring response times and stopping the clock through arriving with a patient. It's a seesaw balance between operational hours output and operational hour delays. So certainly clinical navigators have been having an impact with things like turnaround times at hospital, so that puts more hours back into response. Staff sickness coming down puts more hours into response. But the single biggest change that figure reflects, and I link back to figure 6, is the increase in output. So we've gone from a 95 to 99% output position in Q4 into 115% output position in Q1, as in now in real time. As I alluded to before, primarily delivered at present by extra private resource backfilling that position until we can grow our own substantive workforce. But balancing out those lost hours with extra respondable hours is the single biggest change that we've seen that's produced that step change effect, supplemented by other bits that release more hours and put it back into response to the people of Lincolnshire.
So if I can summarise it, it's nothing to do with the innovations that are being put in place, it's the amount of resources that are now at play that's provided the step change.
I would say absolutely the innovation that we're doing is part of that equation, but the number one weighted part of that equation, certainly for the past 2 months, is the physical resource injection. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Cleaver next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking at figure 2, which seems to be one of the key things in your report, for which thank you, by the way. Yes, as Councillor Allen referred to, there has clearly been a step change in performance since March, which is, of course, welcome. But notwithstanding that, I note that the times quoted for May, last month, are still double the target. It's still taking more than twice as long, both on category 1, but on category 2, sorry, twice as long on category 2 at least. So, I mean, the key question for me is, do you feel you have the measures in place, the resources in place, the assets in place to actually get to the target? And if so, when do you expect that to happen, please? Thank you.
So what I would say in terms of target and performance, the current target, the national target, is not for this financial year 18 minutes and 40 minutes. The national position is that by the end of this financial year, every ambulance service regionally in the country is meeting a C2 30-minute, 30-minute mean, as opposed to the 18-minute mean. So everything we're striving towards currently is to meet that 30-minute mean average across the year by year end. And then the following year, 24-25, is when we've been instructed and directed to be meeting the traditional national standard, the 18-minute, 40-minute, in terms of ambulance services nationally and EMAS regionally. So to answer the second part of your question, everything that we're doing and everything we've described is building towards an organisational strategic plan that says EMAS will meet 30 minutes C2 mean by the end of this financial year, and that's what our strategy is built upon.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Morgan for the last question, and I do need to wrap it up realistically because we've got Pete Burnett who's been waiting since 11:30.
Thank you. I'm sure actually we might want to give a vote of thanks across the board for all of the wonderful work that your folk do. They are on the front line, and they have no idea what they're going into every single time they receive a call. And I don't think any of us would like to be in that position. So I do think they do an absolutely incredible job, whatever we're saying now. But I have got some queries picking up on the responses that you've given and the report. You mentioned the increased dependency, which I think is quite concerning actually on the private sector in order to step in on the numbers. How is it we're able to recruit through the private sector but not through the NHS? What's the issue there? What are the skill sets? We've got the table of skill sets. Does that relate just to NHS staff, or is that taking into account the private ambulance crews as well? What are their skill sets? Are they the same? What are we requiring of our through our tenders there? With regards to the winter pressures, a point was made quite rightly earlier, they happen every year. They are expected. But I did wonder if we don't have an issue, and your views would be interested. Now, I think there was still a hangover from COVID, actually, that was touched on several times in the media, but noticeably isn't really referred to in the yellow bar on your graph. And I do know that definitely what was coming back, feedback, was a lot of conditions like flu that you might have expected people to get over actually hit them far worse post-COVID. And I wondered actually if that wasn't largely responsible for that spike in December that you had. And then the other thing did occur to me as well, going back to the peak still continuing into April, was we actually had quite a cold winter still. It wasn't snowflakes, but we had some very, very cold nights. And going back to the cost of living crisis, I wondered how many cases that you were dealing with of people whose living conditions were such that they were suffering far more during the cold weather than they perhaps may have years before. Your views on that would be appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor Morgan. I'll try and take those in order if I can. So again, we will take back the vote of thanks to all of the staff, and I'll make sure we put out that message. So thank you for that. The dependence upon the private sector, yes, we are reliant to a degree at the moment on private ambulance providers. We use two providers, so that is Elite and CMS Medical Services, Central Medical Services. They both go through a tender process that is driven regionally by EMAS with an expected standard of service delivery, which includes a specification for qualifications on those ambulances. So this is an interim position because they are able to supply very quickly the numbers of staff that we need. That provision will be tailed off over the next 2 years as our workforce plan that we've referred to starts to kick in. So it is an interim dependence only, but as Neil and I think others have alluded to, that has given us an improved position in terms of performance because it's added to our resource. So hopefully that the skill sets on the private ambulance providers we do monitor. So they are a minimum of a technician and an emergency care assistant on each crew. If that drops below that, so we have 2 unqualified personnel, that ambulance is used very differently and works more with our urgent care transport tier. So we are monitoring the skill set availability on a daily basis through our duty managers in the ops centre. In terms of your question around whether flu was far worse over this winter, whether we all took longer to recover from whatever, that's a difficult one for us to answer. Again, I think that is more of a public health question. If you're asking us, did we see a greater acuity of respiratory patients this year? I think the answer would probably be, or is, yes, we have, and we still are. Respiratory conditions form a large part of the presentations that we see. And indeed, yesterday was a peak for respiratory conditions again, but for very different reasons. So I think our public health colleagues will be able to will hopefully help with a more detailed answer on that one. And in terms of the cost of living, did we see any impact? I think, yes, we did. But actually what we did do when we did see a level of impact to that degree is we managed as we would do clinically, but then we also submitted safeguarding concerns around the living conditions of people who were having obvious difficulty in terms of cost of living crisis and heating their particular residences. So again, hopefully we're helping the system by safety netting some of those patients that we unfortunately attended. So I don't know, Councillor Morgan, there were a few questions. I hope I've captured most of your queries in there.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I've just got 2 questions myself, and then I'm going to move to a proposal. So my first question is, are there expected national rates or targets for emergency ambulance conveyance on see and treat and hear and treat?
Neil, do you want to?
Yeah, certainly. So there's reports that are driven by what the trends are doing, but no, the hard targets in effect are the performance times as opposed to the conveyance rates themselves. Individual systems, such as NHS Lincolnshire, NHS England Midlands may well set goals and standards, but in terms of a hard national target, no, there is not.
Okay, thank you. My second question is, if all hospital handovers were within 30 minutes, by how much would there be a change in response times? For example, how much closer would you be to getting to Category 2 targets of 30 or even 18 minutes?
So I can't answer that question immediately in terms of it's a very metricy question. However, what I would say is when we look at daily performance from April to now, and we look at the days when the hospitals, not just ULHT, but surrounding sites are performing well, and we've got minimal low centiles of lost hours, then we are certainly for whole 24-hour periods significantly under the C230 performance, and we're delivering it. And for periods where within Lincolnshire the stars are aligned, if you like, in terms of operational output, hospital delays, etc. Certainly for significant chunks of time, we're delivering even under the 18 minutes. So certainly, I guess to get where you're coming from, is it achievable? Yes, it is. And we do see it for pockets of time. Of course, the way the data is presented, the way the data is reported nationally is monthly, quarterly, but certainly within that, when you look below the surface, it is achievable when things are going in the right direction and aligned appropriately.
Okay, thank you. In which case, I'm now going to move to a proposal. I propose that we thank the presenters from East Midlands Ambulance Service and to welcome the improvements in ambulance response times since the peaks of December 2022 and the Clinical Navigator Initiative at Lincoln County and Pilgrim Hospital, Boston, and to look forward to the trust-wide investment of £23 million during 23-24, leading to further improvements, particular for Category 2 calls, and to request a further update after a period of 6 months, and also to put on record our thanks to all the staff for their continued hard work. Do I have a seconder to my proposal? Thank you, Councillor Linda Wootton. All in favour, please show. Thank you. That's supported. Any against? Any abstentions? Thank you, Councillor Arenbach. She abstained. Thank you. In which case, that's supported. We'll now move on to agenda item 9, NHS Joint Forward Plan. This item was circulated as part of the agenda pack on pages 35 to 42. I understand the aim of this item is to ensure this committee is cited on the work to date and the next steps, and the NHS will be planning further events in the summer beyond the initial 2-week engagement period. I also understand the committee is not required to provide any feedback, but may do so if wishes. I will now hand over to our presenter, Pete Burnett, Director of Strategic Planning for the Integration and Partnerships of the NHS's Lincolnshire Integrated Board. Apologies for the delay, Pete. I understand that you do need to get to another meeting, so we'll try and be as brief as possible, and I'll hand over to you now.
No, thanks, Chair. Much appreciated. So I'm planning to run through, don't worry about the timings. I knew that these things happen, so it's one of those things. So I'm planning to just run through a presentation, if that's okay, and then happy to take any questions towards the end. So I'll just share my screen. So the purpose really is to just describe of this presentation what we have to do in the NHS, how we've gone about doing it, and actually what we're looking to have in our plan, and then next steps going forward. So hopefully the committee is fully aware of the work that's been undertaken. So the action required is for the NHS, for the ICB, and its partner trust within the integrated care system. So in our case, ULHT, LCHS, LPFT, and EMAS. We have a duty to prepare a joint forward plan before the start of each financial year, and normally that would be censored and published in March. For this year, however, NHS England gave us a publication date of the end of June, noting it was the first time we'd had to publish a joint forward plan. So that's why it's a bit later in the year. As we go through this, we'll be doing this after Christmas, or the refresh of the documents after Christmas, publishing in March. And the aim is through that process, we have to consult the ICP, or the Integrated Care Partnership, and the Health and Wellbeing Board, which took place yesterday. Unlike other NHS guidance, so those who can remember the long-term plan back in 2018, NHS gave us local system significant flexibility to determine kind of the scope of the work and how the joint forward plan will be structured, as well as having some legal duties that you need to tie into it. But it was far more flexible, and therefore I think when you review, or if you review other joint forward plans up and down the country, they could be different from one ICS to another, and that's just the way the guidance is written in that sense. So our approach was determined by us locally, and therefore I'll go through that approach in future slides. So one thing to be clear is what the relationship is between the joint forward plan that talking to you today about, and the Health and Wellbeing Board strategy and the Integrated Care Partnership strategy, and how we try as best we can to make sure there's a synergy between the three and they link together. So there is a legal requirement. There's a legal requirement for obviously the Health and Wellbeing Board to have a Health and Wellbeing Board strategy, and obviously that sits with the County Council. There's also a requirement for the Integrated Care Partnership to have an Integrated Care Partnership strategy, and obviously in a simple system like us, where we only have one Health and Wellbeing Board, they kind of co-term this together. And then there's now a requirement as part of the legislation that was passed last year for the NHS to have a joint forward plan that sets out our kind of aims for the next 5 years for the population, but we refresh annually. So to try and keep them as aligned together, we have all three strategies of the same ambition, which is for people to start life well, live well, age well, and die well. And they also have the same aims within all three documents. So we're measuring the same things as that part of it. But for those members of the public, quite rightly say, why have you got three documents? Partly because we have to, but and therefore when we've worked through this together, what we're going to say, the Health and Wellbeing Board strategy says what are the health needs that need addressing within Lincolnshire. The Integrated Care Partnership says, but this is how, as an integrated care system, so that health care, local authority, third sector come together in an integrated way to on key focuses to kind of deliver the kind of need identified in the Health and Wellbeing Board strategy. And therefore the joint forward plan articulates, our aim is to articulate what the NHS is planning to do for the next 5 years, aligned to that work and underpinned by the JSNA's or the joint strategic health needs assessments taking place by Public Health. So actually we're all focusing and working in a similar way. So when we started on the work, one of the key things we started with was a steering group to take the work forward, and that the role of the steering group was to ensure actually the structure and process we took in developing the plan, whatever the plan kind of ended up with, was done in a way that we thought was meaningful and as best we could, given the timescales we had to pull the plan together. That steering group had members of the public involved from the outset as part of that work, had Health Watch involved, NHS partners within the NHS, local authority involved, and the PCN Alliance, to ensure that actually we had rounded thinking on this. And the first step we did was, right, we were going to have a workshop to look at what our priorities should be, but we tried to undertake initial engagements to ensure that actually we had inputs into that workshop based on what we'd heard from different parts of Lincolnshire and the NHS. So we had a very time limited engagement with the public, led by Health Watch and the NHS engagement team, which I'll reference on the next slide. We worked with our clinical and professional groups within the NHS to get their views clinically on what they believe the priorities should be. And then we worked obviously with NHS organisational senior management teams to say, okay, what do you think the priorities should be? And they fed into workshop one, which I will touch on in a bit. But in terms of public engagement, so throughout this process, we try to involve the public where possible, but we are limited by the timescales we have to produce a plan in this first instance. The engagement for the 2 weeks prior to that first workshop, we had a Health Watch survey that had over 1,000 responses to that. Health Watch also ran 2 webinars, and our engagement team went out and about the county to gain people's views on what they felt the kind of the priorities within the NHS should be going forward, and we got Health Watch then to kind of work through that feedback and collate it into kind of key priorities based on what the public view was, and that went into the workshop one, which I'll discuss in a second. That was quite clear what the public's view were in terms of where our priorities should sit, and no surprise that access, workforce, were key kind of elements within that feedback. Personalised care wasn't necessarily described as that, but care that looks at the need of the individual and support they need personally came out of that review and fed heavily into the kind of the first workshop. So in terms of workshops, we had a workshop at the start of March that was involved members of the public, the different areas of primary care, the trusts within the system, the local authority, Health and Wellbeing Board, and we came together, had Public Health present to the group what the kind of health needs were of the population. We had Health Watch present their the findings of the public engagement exercise, and then we kind of looked at, okay, well, how many priorities should we be focused on in the next 5 years, and then looking at all the priorities we had, working through them and roundtable discussion, which should be our focus. And I should say, and I'll touch on the priorities later on, that's not to say there are other mandates within the NHS. You just had EMAS and the time issues that they're trying to address and work through, and where we're supporting them as a system on. That is still a key element of the NHS, an NHS mandate and NHS planning operations that we need to do. But this is about priorities that we want to focus on and believe we should move forward on. So after that workshop took place, we set up working groups within the NHS with senior clinicians involved, and some areas with public health as well, to look at kind of what do we mean by the priorities. So we identified 5 kind of areas we want to focus on, and they looked to shape them up and kind of work through what that would look like. They then presented that work at a further workshop in April with the same invite to the same people who were at the first workshop, and presented back to them. So this is what we believe the scope of this work is over the next 5 years. This is where we should be focusing, and this is what we're trying to achieve. And that was a kind of confirm and challenge session. So we had round group tables that looked at each priority, fed back to the group. And so we took that information at the end of that session and then kind of developed the priorities further. And that's what actually we're presenting out at the moment on our engagement activity. And it kind of to the core of the priorities I put in the paper. So moving on, so the core of our strategy, and one of the key things that came out of the workshop, or the overwhelming piece that came out of the workshop, was at the heart of our strategy is a new relationship with the public. You'll see that's one of the priorities, but that was front and centre of all the discussions we had in those groups, and that's something that is a cultural change programme that isn't necessarily just going to be delivered in 5 years, and I don't think we'll ever completely crack it, but real emphasis on trying to kind of change that relationship in a different way. So that requires us to prepare to do things differently. We need to understand what matters to ourselves and to each other, and that includes our workforce and the people we're treating, their families and carers. We need to work together for the well-being of everyone, so we need to make sure that work continues. Have conversations with people, not about people, and make the most of what we have available. So this is, and it's in the document, it is underpinned by we've only got a finite resources. We haven't got lots of new money coming in to drive this forward, so we have to have honest conversation about what we can do together. But that conversation piece needs to be, and that relationship needs to be at the heart of what we're trying to do. But in terms of the priorities, the 5 priorities, as I said, that new relationship with the public was the key one, but is the heart of what we're trying to do. Priority 2 was living well, staying well. So that's around prevention and what the NHS can do in terms of prevention. And priority 3 is improving access. Priority 4 around integrated community care, and priority 5 a happy and valued workforce. And I'll touch on them briefly in the next couple of slides. But alongside that, key themes that came out of the workshops were around integration and the need to integrate our services as effectively as possible. The need to focus on excellence, but excellence in everything we do. So as well as the excellence in care, it's excellence in terms of how we speak to each other, excellence in terms of the food we provide, and the cleaning that takes place. And that should be our kind of core element of what we're looking to do. And also innovation, and innovating our care. So we are areas where we provide care that is excellent, and people come to see us and say, how do you provide care in this setting? How have you gone to do that? Based by and underpinned by clinical excellence as part of that work. So they're the kind of core priorities and themes that we have now in our joint forward plan. So just touching on what's in them. So that new relationship with the public, that's around creating that shared agreement about how we work together and how we kind of do this going forward. That's the crux of it. But it's also around shared decision making, developing, designing services together, and working with people and their families to manage their own health and well-being work. And I should say, with all these priorities, we're not starting from a blank piece of page. There's a lot of work taking place in this area already. LPFT won an award last week, or I think it's this week, on how they co-produced and co-designed their new kind of ward environment at Lincoln County. So none of this work is starting from a blank piece of paper, but there is clearly a lot more to do. On living well and staying well, we've adopted what is in the Health and Wellbeing Board, or will be in the Health and Wellbeing Board strategy going forward, in the JSNA approach around the life cycle model. In part of the feedback we've had this week, we're probably looking to take off the age brackets here, because what one person's aging well or working age may be different to others. So we just need to reflect that as we review the document in its current state. So in terms of improving access, this is really focused on trying to do as much care, and these two priorities link together well. It's about how do we provide services close to home, how do we make sure actually we can move that members of public can access those services because they've got the right skills and expertise to provide that service in that environment, and also how do we simplify the processes for access and healthcare. And on integrated community care, that's kind of how we then come together. It's always been at the heart of doing care close to home and out in the community, and this includes the acute sector as well, for the mental health and community and primary care. But how do we integrate our workforce and our approach to be wrap around the person when they need that kind of a high level of care, but also provide that kind of support in the community? A real focus and shift to try and move that activity away from secondary care and more specialised services. And then finally, obviously a happy and valued workforce. Work is obviously undertaking this area already, but how we value our people, grow our people, key in line with the integrated care partnership, grow our people from the our local population, and more importantly also retain them once they come to work in the NHS, keeping them, helping them they want to stay and work with us and have long, vibrant careers going forward. So they're the priorities. In this month, we've got a 2-week exercise of engagement around 13 locations and 24 different community groups. That includes our patient participation group, certain community groups. I've been to Rotary Club, for example, up in Mablethorpe. They're in schools in Grantham, a team in schools in Grantham yesterday, and they're debating society to look at this. We are trying to keep this as wide scope as possible. Got 2 meetings, as I said, with our patient representatives. Presenting here today, presenting at the Joint Health and Wellbeing Board yesterday. Health Watch are running webinars with our staff, and following that this work will then kind of refine the document in its current guise that we look to publish at the end of June. However, we're aware that that engagement is only, both times round, is only 4 weeks in total, and we need to continue to engage on this work going forward. So that's what our focus is going to be over the summer and into the autumn in terms of what this means. We need to work together and go, what are the kind of key measures that the members of our public want to see from this, that they believe would show that we have been successful. We're aligning this with our operational plan because it clearly does exist, but we're going to further develop the subsequent years over the next couple of months, align with what success would look like and agree those kind of success measures going forward. So as we come into next year, the plan will be further refreshed with more detail going into it and with a far greater voice of the public involved. But that's where we are. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Have we any questions at this point? No, I've got two, if I may, then for the moment, Pete. My first is, what improvements will patients see as a result of the joint forward plan?
So I think the key of improvement is how we work together, and that's as the core focus, how we work together with our public and how we go around kind of developing services going forward. Obviously, improvement in access, improvement in that kind of provision in the community, and an improved workforce. But we need to work together. So the work so far has identified what those priorities are. We need to work collectively with the members of the public, with our stakeholders, to go, what success look like here then? Because what I might consider to be success might not be what the population or key elements of our community want to see as success, and we end up patting ourselves on the back but actually missing the point on what's important to the public. So I think there's a key. So we do want to see improvements as identified, but actually we really want to do that engagement with the public to kind of really make sure our success measures are in line with what they're looking for.
Thank you, that's reassuring to hear. When is it likely that the developed priorities document will be completed and in turn shared with the committee?
During the autumn, so we are looking to do that work, more detailed work over the summer period, along with the engagement work. So we can certainly come back with the schedule of kind of what the milestones will look like over the future years, and what the kind of success measures will look like. We've got to be realistic. If it's a 5-year plan as laid down by legislation, but 5 years is a long time. So certainly be more detail the next 2 to 3 years with probably milestones indicated for the future years that we want to aim to at that stage.
Okay, thank you. I had no one indicate, so I'm going to move. Oh, Councillor Makinson Sanders.
From the public point of view, this is all lovely, and it's lovely to have strategies and all the rest of it. But like you said, how will the public see any difference? That's huge dissatisfaction with the GP type services and community care. I don't see anything in there that makes me think, whoop, that's going to be really good for any of our residents. And I just think that's really sad. We put together report after report after report, and do we see, where's the progress?
Well, I don't agree that we have huge dissatisfaction with the we have dissatisfaction in some access to GP care, but I think the feedback we receive isn't huge dissatisfaction with the healthcare that are provided by our staff across the NHS. But the key to this is doing that work with the at heart of this is doing that relationship differently with the public, and it's going out and saying what matters to you. And we're not saying at this stage this is the final plan. It's the plan we have to have published by June. There's more work to do on that, and that's when we come back later in the year. That's a good time you go, well, this isn't really changing anything, you're just ticking the boxes. And how are you really, you should be holding me to how you live in that new relationship with the public, because that's what's heart and centre, front and centre of this plan, and that's what we need to be progressing on going forward. So yes, the key things you would have heard before, they're not new. If you look at long-term plan, integrated community care, there isn't the focus on but there isn't anything. It's about how you do that effectively and how we deliver it in line with the public. So I don't think that actually it's wrong for it to be in there, but that work with the public and what this looks like, what success looks like, and what matters to them is crucial. And I think that is a different approach than we've done before.
Hey, thank you. I've got Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. It follows on from the previous point, and we constantly hear reports here, and it's caring the community, caring the community. But what does, in real terms, in real reality, other than being outside of a hospital environment, what does that mean for the public? Because certain residents I speak to, and myself, and I'm probably showing my old-fashioned cynicism, when I was a boy, if it was care in the community, the code word for that, the subcode word, meant care on cheap. Now, I'm not saying it does in this case, that's not fair, but that is a perception that a lot of people have if you say those words. Now, I can't see how that strategy is going to particularly change that, and it might not be that's not its purpose, but somewhere in documents that's within the NHS and the trusts and everything else, there's got to be a means to change that perception, because that's still quite strong. And certainly in my part of the world, Chairman, it's very rural. When people hear that, the thing I always get is, oh, that means I'll never be able to go into the hospital when I need to. I'll never be able to see X, Y, and Z when I actually need to see them, because that's what that's replacing. Whether that's true or otherwise, that's the perception, and actually that's what matters, because that's what the public think.
Yeah, so I don't think it's not about care on the cheap. It's about care in the right appropriate setting, and actually being cared for in your place where you live in your local community has significant advantages than being taken into specialist care areas later in your care pathway than you should be. So for a good example of this, and then to prove where that reshift is done, that is around mental health. So back in the 80s, we had large kind of hospitals, inpatient settings where lots of people who had mental health conditions lived and resided and spent their entire lives there. And actually, if you look at anywhere in the NHS it's transformed, across mental health services, they've provided that service now out into the community and moved the people live vibrant, healthy, successful lives out in the community, where previously it was done in a hospital setting. So I think there is this over-reliance that unless you go to an inpatient facility, that the care you get isn't what you need, isn't necessarily correct. And on our ambulance and our emergency calls, what we need to do is make sure people arrive at A&E and have that inpatient setting when it's needed, but in a planned way where possible, because there is a wraparound support in the community. So if someone's getting to older in life, they are known to the teams locally. So if they have to go into hospital, actually, it's not a surprise that the people suddenly treating this has come out of the blue. There's a clear care plan in place for this person. It's easier, they go in, have the specialist care, but it's easier to get them back out because they are known to the local community teams. They've worked with them already, and they can actually be discharged out of their place of residence, because anyone who you wouldn't want to spend lots and lots of time in hospital. I have my own relatives who spent too long a time in hospital and couldn't get back out into the system, back out to their home where they wanted to reside and spend the rest of the end of their life in. And I think so. I don't think it is is done on the cheap. It's done on actually where it's best to be provided, and that then leaves our kind of hospital systems to provide the specialist care that actually patients might require at that stage. Yet actually, largely it happens in and around our local communities where most of the time.
I accept that point, Jem. My point was, and I accept the answer, my point was there are some who perceive it that way, and I say I'm not saying that's correct, and that's where yourselves come in. You've got to do and we will help you as much as we can, but we're not health professionals. We can't talk the talk as well as you can, and it's about changing that perception, which is a very old perception. It was around when I was a boy in the early 1990s, but that perception is still about, and it's about changing that, and actually what you're doing, it's actually making everybody feel that, yes, that everybody has access to that, and it does work. And that was the point. I accept the point you make entirely, that actually the worst place you can be once you're medically well is in a hospital bed, which is where care in the community comes in. Totally accept that, but it's about changing that public perception, which is very difficult at the minute with other issues within the system.
Yeah, no, and I think that's why that relationship is at the centre of this, because actually working together with the public, I think the local authority have done that very well. Adult social care have done that. Mental health actually do that really well in the NHS, but we need to do it better across the whole NHS. And I think that engagement, that work in local communities, what matters to them, what this means is crucial. But that is a cultural change programme that we need to, whether we're committed to doing, but will take time to do. But through that work, yes, we need to have those open, honest discussions of what it means and why we believe this is the right thing to do.
Okay, thank you. In which case, I'm going to move to the proposal. I propose that we support the process and the steps taken to develop the joint forward plan, that we note the requirement for the NHS to develop a joint forward plan, to note that the National Health Service Act 2006, as amended by the Health and Care Act 2022, requires ICBs and their partner trusts to prepare a joint forward plan before the start of each financial year, that we agree to receive further reports as required, and finally to support the 5 priorities to be included in the NHS joint forward plan and look forward to the details of their implementation. Do I have a seconder for my proposal? Councillor Cleaver, thank you. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. That's supported unanimously. Thank you, Pete, for your presentation. Sorry to have kept you waiting.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now move on to agenda item 10, GP provision in Lincolnshire. There are 2 reports to consider as part of this item. Report 1 is a report from the Lincolnshire Local Medical Committee on pages 43 to 48, which will be presented by Dr. Reid Baker, the Local Medical Committee's Medical Director. And number 2, a report from NHS Lincolnshire's Integrated Care Board on pages 49 to 77, which will be presented by Sarah Jane Mills, Director of Primary Care, Community and Social Value from the Integrated Care Board, and also Nick Blake, I believe, has joined you as well today. So I'll hand over to you just for a quick run through, and we'll take questions at the very end across the whole item, please. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Reid and I will present jointly and then answer questions in a similar vein. So if I can just start by drawing out a few points from my report. Since we last joined you, which I think was in April, we have 81 GP practices across the county. That is a reduction of 1, and you'll be aware that the Spalding GP practice closed. There are currently 15 primary care networks, but the Solus Primary Care Network, which covers Spilsby, Stickney, will be forming and joining with the First Coastal as a rural directorate of that. So going forward, we will have 14 primary care networks. Primary care provision across Lincolnshire continues to be good. There is excessive demand in terms of access from people living across our communities, but over the last year, general practice has provided just shy of 5 million appointments. That doesn't include the appointments associated with COVID vaccinations or the appointments associated with the additional staff recruited by PCNs. So it's actually an understatement of the number of appointments. With regards to those appointments, 46% were seen on the day, 53% on the day or the next day, and 82% within 14 days. And just putting this in context with other parts of the country, from a Lincolnshire perspective, the rate of appointments per 10,000 patients was 5,637, which compares with the national average of 5,103. So you can see that actually the rate is much higher. In addition, since we last met, the enhanced access appointments have gone live. And again, Lincolnshire provides above the required level, so just shy of 65 minutes per thousand population against a target of 60. 72.2% of those appointments were face-to-face, and the utilisation was 78.9, compared with an average of 80%. And we really want to encourage people to utilise those extended access appointments. Across Lincolnshire, the quality of services, I've recorded the current position with regards to the CQC rating. Whilst we undertake our own quality assessments, we rely on their independent assessment, and again, you can see the information there. With regards to workforce, the Lincolnshire position reflects the national position in terms of challenge around general practice practitioner recruitment. So GPs make up approximately 30% of our total workforce, but we do have a significant increase in the number of GPs in training, which links to our strategy to improve that. And we have strong multidisciplinary team working both within GP practices themselves and in our wider primary care networks. On the 9th of May, the NHS published a delivery plan to support recovery of primary care, and this reflects the feedback both from patients and professionals with regards to the challenges in terms of accessing general practice services. There are 4 elements: empowering patients, which is about developing the NHS app, self-directed care, and extending community pharmacy services; modern GP access, which is about modernising telephony, online requests, and faster navigation. And we've had lots of discussions previously about the role of the navigator at the front door to make sure that people access the right member in the team. Building that capacity, so continuing to develop the multidisciplinary team, looking to increase new doctors, and also target retention and return of GPs that are approaching retirement, and finally reducing bureaucracy, particularly between the correspondence between primary and secondary care. The success of this actually fits really nicely with the areas that Pete has just described in the joint forward plan. And perhaps the most important element is about our relationship with the public and helping the public understand the new service models and how best to utilise those. So I'll hand over to Reid just to highlight anything additionally from his report, and then we'll be happy to take questions, Councillor Macy.
Thanks, Sarah Jane. Good afternoon, committee. Thanks for having us today. Sarah Jane's covered an outline of a lot of the points from my report as well, and hopefully you've had a good time to read both reports. But again, I'll summarise some of the key points from my report. So, as Sarah Jane just alluded to, general practice in Lincolnshire is continuing to work extremely hard for our patients. We are operating in a landscape that's changing and challenging, with about 30% increase in patients over the age of 70 years with more medical conditions since 2010. And these patients tend to value continuity of care, and there's a strong evidence base that such continuity is really, really good for their health outcomes. Conversely, there's an expectation for rapid access to one-off episode of care for younger, usually fit and well patients, and that's significantly increased through the last few years, partly fueled by online consultation tools as part of modernisation of general practice, media campaigns, and then health concerns, partly due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The escalating needs of these very different cohorts of patients have made service delivery for general practice more challenging than ever, but we've continued and will continue to evolve to meet those needs of these different cohorts. So as outlined in both reports, there's been a lot of data gathered since our last meeting of the committee. And as Sarah Jane said, we've increased appointment provision and activity in general practice. We're above the national average on the weighted capitation per appointments in Lincolnshire. We're above the national average in numbers of appointments happening within 24 hours of request, national average being 43.2%, and we're about 46.1 in Lincolnshire. And we're just slightly above the national average for face-to-face appointments as well, at 70.4% compared to 70.1%. At last committee, we did discuss the number of those appointments that were with GPs, and looking at the most recent data, there's been about a 20% increase in the number of appointments that patients in Lincolnshire have had with a GP specifically, rather than one of the wider members of the general practice team. So since the last committee meeting, we've faced some of those continued challenges I talked about last time and that we've already touched upon today in the reports. And there's been new challenges, as there has been across the nation, particularly in terms of cost of living crisis, which has significantly impacted general practice. So there's been roughly a 16% gap over the last 5 years between wage increases and general practice funding. And as we all know, unfortunately, utility bills have gone significantly higher than they were previously, between 17 and 24% rises in practices, with 2.1% of this funded. So as you can see, these elements on top of the demand that's growing in a challenging environment has additionally placed pressure in general practice. And that's affected it to the point where about 75% of practices are concerned that inflation would affect their viability, and it's made them reconsider any future recruitment plans, with maybe 53% of practices thinking about pausing recruitment at the moment, and even around 12% considering redundancy. Now, that's not something none of us want here today, and our patients don't want, because that potentially affects stability and viability of general practice, and that's a risk to those core services as well as any new and expanding initiatives, much like Pete was talking about in terms of the Joint Forward Plan. We need a robust general practice and wider NHS and healthcare system to support those changes for the benefit of patients. So there's the additional challenges we've faced, and as Sarah Jane's just talked about, recovery of access to primary care has recently been published. And in general practice, we acknowledge and support the need to focus capacity we have to support our patients, particularly those who need us the most. And we share that patient frustration when our finite capacities diverted from supporting those patients with what they need from general practice. So the plan does involve additional workload for general practice and poses potential risks. And it's not felt wholly that it provides the significant support we need in general practice in Lincolnshire and nationally to best support our patients. But any successes that do come from the plan won't necessarily resolve those frustrations that we in general practice and our patients share immediately. The investment that's outlined in the plan is welcome. We're concerned it's not recurrent, and it's not for additional general practitioner recruitment, which is what our patients would have traditionally expected, but it's welcome that there's some additional funding to help support the wider workforce in general practice. Looking at that primary care, secondary care interface is really welcomed, because we know that a lot of capacity in general practice is used dealing with matters that wouldn't necessarily be part of core general practice, and that in itself could potentially release a lot of capacity in general practice to support patients with more appointments to help them going forward. The mechanism of how that will work is key so that we can maximise that benefit for patients. We would greatly welcome the robust self-care pathways that I talked about in the recovery plan, because patients need to have an ability to go down those self-care pathways and feel confident in and trust those pathways, and the system needs to support our patients to develop those and feel empowered to access them. And again, that will release an awful lot of capacity in general practice to deal with those patients who really, really need us the most. The plan does rely heavily on significant increase in our colleagues in community pharmacy being a first port of call for a lot of medical conditions, and that's welcomed. You know, our colleagues are highly skilled in community pharmacy, and they're very keen to support patients as we are. But the variability of access to community pharmacy across the geography of Lincolnshire and their own workforce issues does make that a challenge. So again, the detail of how that will work will be key. As Sarah Jane and I have already talked about, telephony and the modernisation of general practice has been underway in Lincolnshire for quite some time, but this plan will accelerate some of those changes and hopefully improve access for some of our patients. But we've got to be cognizant that, you know, if we're increasing access by phone and other methods, we need additional staff to support those inquiries. And so that's a challenge that will be worked through as part of this recovery plan. So in summary, we're delivering increased activity. We are unfortunately working under increasingly challenging conditions of the changing NHS and currently the UK economy. But there's lots of opportunity for further positive change for general practice and our patients. But what we need in general practice in Lincolnshire is the support of yourselves and our patients to understand and support us as we strive to improve their health on an evolving landscape. That's a summary from me. So as Sarah Jane said, happy for us to answer questions now.
Thank you very much. I've got Councillor Ray Wootton first, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Can I refer you to page 53.2 at the bottom, where it says about using technology. Now, I believe in technology, but I'll give you an example. I was contacted by text to contact my surgery to make an appointment. When I phoned them up, they said, ask my GP. So I logged on to ask my GP, sorry, this system is now down for today, try tomorrow. So I tried tomorrow, and it was down again. And I had to phone up again. So ask my GP technology doesn't work. Can I have your views, please?
I'll start and then Reid may want to come in. So I'm sorry you've had that experience. There's two elements. The introduction of text has really made quite a big difference in terms of practices being able to quickly communicate with patients. So we see that as a really, really positive thing and get some very good feedback. In terms of Ask My GP, it's a bit of a conundrum for general practice because the demand is such and the capacity to contact through tools like Ask My GP has driven an increase in demand that they aren't able to match that in terms of the capacity, and that links to some of the things Dr. Baker's described. And so in order to make sure things are clinically safe, they do turn off, in some instances, the Ask My GP tool, so that what they don't do is end up with requests getting lost in there that need an urgent response. Going forward, as we develop the modern GP access, one would hope that we would be able to put the processes in place that mean if it is an urgent request, it can get filtered out into a different way, and that the tool itself will take you straight into the requests that you have. But you're absolutely right. The technology was rolled out very quickly during COVID, and we haven't worked with every practice to do that change process. As part of the recovery plan, there is additional support for practices to actually go back and look at their internal processes to make sure that they work with the new technology. And we've, again, seen some really great success in Lincolnshire. Lincolnshire has been one of the highest uptakes of something called the Accelerator Programme, which is people coming in and working alongside practices to look at those processes. So I'm very encouraged that practices will take that up, but recognise the problem you describe.
Thank you, Sarah Jane, for that answer. My frustration is that, say, I get texts and they're really good, but when you phone the surgery, they say, no, you've got to book through Ask My GP, and you can't get through there. That's the only route to get an appointment. If you can't get there, you're lost.
Absolutely, and that's why that process, sorry, it sounds very managerial, but that change in terms of how things work, so that when you ring the practice, actually they know that they've turned off their Ask My GP, and therefore they deal with your request at that point in time, rather than direct you to something that at that point in time isn't available to you.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. Thank you, Chairman.
Councillor Allen?
Thank you, Chairman. I find it a bit difficult because this report is very similar to the one that we had about 6 months ago. Basically saying we're very busy, you know, and we don't know what to do in terms of actually improving some of the issues that we get complained to about by our residents. The appointments, last time they came up, I did ask, you know, is a two-stage appointment, 2 appointments when you're doing it on online, because my wife tried to contact the GP service, and she was told the doctor would talk to her, which he did. So that's 1 appointment, presumably. He asked for her to take a photograph of the issue that she was worried about and send it through to him, and then he'd look at it, and then he'd ring her back. And is that another appointment? Are you sure? I do wonder whether that is the case or not. And of course, appointments include all the other directions that you can now go to within general practice in terms of all the extra resources that they've generally got, quite rightly, so that you actually go in practice into the right direction, rather than necessarily having to end up talking to the GP himself. But the figures do indicate that a lot of these increased appointments are going through the online situation and are going into the support staff. The GPs are not necessarily doing a significant amount of the increase in the appointments that's taking place, which is the object of the exercise to a great extent. But we have got, according to you, 10% more GPs now working in Lincolnshire. And I suppose, you know, that, and like Councillor Wootton said, I've tried to use the, if you don't ring at 8 o'clock, and my surgery's got a digital system, and if you don't ring at 8 o'clock, you won't get an appointment. Or you won't get into a possible appointment with either the GP or somebody else. And if you don't ring at 8 o'clock, and if you do get an appointment, if you do get to the receptionist, the triage person who directs you elsewhere, if you don't do that at 8 o'clock, you won't get in contact with that one. I managed to get in contact with the receptionist at 8 o'clock, and she said, no, you don't need to see the GP, you need to see the nurse practitioner. I'll put you through to her. So she put me through to her. The nurse practitioner obviously wasn't there because nobody answered the phone. And it then cuts off after 30 seconds, and I go back to the end of the queue, which at 8 o'clock means I'm not going to get an appointment. So that's, you know, that's a digital system working for you. It doesn't work. Because what's the point of putting me through to a nurse practitioner that's not in the surgery, and I can't talk to her? I just wasted, you know, whatever it is, amount of time in my life trying to do something which obviously doesn't work. If the receptionist doesn't know that the person is not there, then I shouldn't be put through to a person that doesn't exist at that point in time. And the only way around that is to go on to go into the online service. What is it called? My GP. Ask My GP, which opens at 8:30. And if you don't get on there at 8:30 with filling in all the forms and so on, by 8:35 they're all filled in, because there's only a certain number of appointments that they will put through Ask My GP, and when it's filled out with those appointments, no matter what the appointments, you know, no matter what the people are putting onto that system, it just closes down, and that's it for the day. So,
can I just ask, Councillor, although it's useful to get the background and understand where you're coming from, if we can try and round it up for a question?
What the question is?
Yeah, sometimes it's difficult then for our presenters to try and unravel it and therefore cover everything that you're trying to cover.
The question is, how are we going to deal with the issues that are facing our residents in terms of accessing primary care? because we keep on asking this question and we keep on getting reports about how busy everybody is. But the reports do suggest that there are more resources going into primary care within the GPs, in terms of GPs themselves and support staff. But it doesn't seem to actually bring about any real improvements to the residents of Sleaford trying to access that primary care system.
Can I come in there, Sarah Jane, or do you want to?
Yes, please.
Doctor? Thanks, Councillor Rowland. I'll try and answer some of those points. I think the data, we discussed data last time at length, I think, didn't we? And as we've talked about already, and in the recovery document, there's a lot of work going on nationally and locally, and the LMC being part of that, in terms of getting as accurate and robust and reflective data as we possibly can across practice in Lincolnshire. And actually what we think is the data that we're collecting is still underreporting the levels of activity. I agree there are different types of activity than we may have ever seen before. If we'd done digital data collection 20 years ago, we've got all these other healthcare professionals working in practices and with practices in Lincolnshire. So I think there is more work to do with that. What I would say is our reference point at the moment, while we continue to work on that, which is complex across multiple practices in Lincolnshire who have different systems, because those systems seem to work better for their paid populations than a system for a practice in a different town or rural location, is that if we compare to national figures, what we may assume, and I know assumption can cause problems, is that things that we're doing in Lincolnshire in terms of how we record things may be similar to what is happening across the country. So in terms of your question about how an appointment is populated onto the data set, and is it one appointment, two appointments, etc., then that is something we're working through, but maybe it's mirroring what's happening nationally, so that our increase in appointment activity is probably a true reflection, but still an under reporting. In terms of you saying more appointments are with other health professionals, I agree. That's because we have more and more health professionals in our MDTs, in practices and in PCNs. And that's because we've recruited well into Lincolnshire, as we talked about last time, partly because the direction of travel was, as I've alluded to, very different cohorts of patients who have different requirements from general practice now than we might have seen 5, 10, 15 years ago, whatever time period you might want to put on there. And therefore we knew that we might need colleagues who could help people with those specific things. So we have lots of elderly patients with complex medications, multiple medications, and a clinical pharmacist has an expert in-depth knowledge of all those medications and interactions, and so they're really well placed to help patients with those medication reviews that maybe general practitioners would have done previously, before we had clinical pharmacists in general practice. So I think we will see that, and allied to that, of course, is what we talked about before with challenges to GP recruitment in Lincolnshire. And so those the challenges with GP recruitment and retention, allied with recruiting well into ARS posts, nurse practitioner posts, etc. in Lincolnshire, is why we see that those different proportions of appointments for GPs and non-GPs in practices. But as I said, in the data still suggests it's about 20% more appointments since the last committee meeting with GPs specifically. In terms of Ask My GP and how it works, going back to Councillor Wootton's question and your question, I think it's a challenge because it's a balance between access and safe capacity. And as Sarah Jane alluded to, it's also making sure that your request for that serious illness that needs me to see it straight away is not lost between the less urgent requests. And again, that's something with the system providers, like Ask My GP, eConsult, etc., that is being worked on continuously to decide that to make it clearer when practices are looking through their work streams that such cases can be highlighted. But the key thing there is giving safe capacity. And I think the last thing we would want is to not see your request amongst many others. It is frustrating, and I think going back to Councillor Wootton's point about the text and then Ask My GP being turned off, I think it's a bit of a rock and a hard place, because what practices are trying to do is give you information. So your blood tests seem okay, but please contact us routinely to discuss this with a clinical pharmacist, for example. It is then frustrating if you try and contact a practice and the Ask My GP or whatever access points they've got are turned off for the day due to, say, capacity issues. But what we're trying to address is giving you that information, that reassurance that actually your tests are okay, but get in contact with us. Whereas traditionally you might have then been chasing us for a few weeks before all these systems were in place to even find out what your results were. So there's work still to be done, but I think there's been great improvements in communication and getting messaging out to our patients. But the work that we've alluded to in terms of the recovery plan and work that was already ongoing in Lincolnshire will support that going forward.
Thank you, Nick. You want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think Dr. Baker really touched on the point I was going to make at the end there. I think the experiences that both councillors have described are experiences that have led to the recovery plan and the focus on access. You know, people having that 8 a.m. rush, trying to call into their practice to get an appointment, maybe having their call dropped, or when they speak to somebody, getting told to call back. So the access recovery plan really focuses in on addressing that particular issue amongst a couple of others. That's an experience lots of people have. It's certainly something that we and NHS England want to do, and GP practice want to do something about. And the Access Recovery Plan sets out some of the things we can do about that. I think what we'll start to see is the dial turning on those issues over the next year. And we're not going to get it sorted straight away, but some of the things we're putting in place, looking at the processes that GP practices have, trying to support practices use the capacity they do have available to them to the best possible to optimise capacity, and also support with recruitment, etc. We'll all start to turn the dial, and we should see less issues with people being asked to call back or being uncertain about what's going to happen next. So I think it is watch this space, but there's a really clear plan about what we need to do and how we need to work with GP practices to improve matters for patients.
If I could just come back. We can tinker with the systems as much as we want, you know, digital phone systems and all these sorts of things. We can play around with the online accessibilities, which provide, you know, another way of accessing the system. But again, it only works to a certain period of time. The real issue is the resources. And indeed, you can employ, you know, more nurse practitioners or physiotherapists or whatever you want. But people really want to talk. The complaints I get is people want to talk to their doctor, and they feel it's an issue, whatever it is. You may not feel so, but they certainly do. And the real issue is that we have a resource issue with GPs. There are not enough of them doing doctoring work. Not enough of them in terms of numbers, and there's not enough of them actually doing, you know, the amount of work that's actually required. And this is what the NHS needs to actually sort out. We need more GP resources doing GP work. And until we actually address that, we can tinker forevermore with the systems, but we will not be able to get and see the doctors that we want. I'm very happy to be able to go to my people in Lincolnshire and say things are a lot worse elsewhere, but you know, that only goes so far, I'm afraid.
Yeah, can I just come back in briefly about people wanting to see their GP? I think it's a really good point. I think we did touch upon it at the last committee meeting, and I think you know, that's what in general practice we all probably perceived was how general practice would run, and it did, didn't it? For many years, you'd probably see your GP or your nurse, and they were the main people that would be in general practice. But again, going back to those cohorts of patients that we talked about, and the workforce issues that exist across general practice and the wider NHS, there's a diversification of the staffing in general practice and in hospital settings as well, and community settings. And so part of the work that's being done is about these other colleagues, and actually that they may be best suited to seeing your needs. So as I've already alluded to, your clinical pharmacist, for example, is best placed to deal with your complex multiple medications. Or if you contact us, and I think I may have made this point back in the last meeting, if you've got a problem with your hip or your shoulder, you are much better seeing a first contact physiotherapist than myself as a normal GP without special interest in musculoskeletal issues. And part of what we need to do, and we are doing as a system and nationally, is highlighting to patients that might be the best disposition for them, and they'll get a timely and comprehensive assessment, which will then give them the best treatment pathway subsequently. And that is out of kilter with the traditional model of general practice and the wider NHS, but that's with the direction of travel nationally, and where a lot of these things about GP recovery plan and PCN R's staff, that's what all this addresses. But it is getting that publicised to patients, getting that understanding there, so that when somebody needs to see me as a GP rather than the clinical pharmacist or the first contact physiotherapist or the care coordinator or any of our colleagues that we've got through the R scheme, that they can see me because we've appropriately allocated capacity to all of our colleagues. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Cleaver next, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few quick queries and questions. On the question of the CQC ratings data, I do recall the last time we discussed this, it was requested that we see how the trend is going with the most recent ones that have been done. And I'm a bit disappointed to see that isn't in this report. So I took the liberty of looking it up myself and was quite disturbed to discover that from October last year until now, 4 CQC reports have been issued, which represents 5% of all the GP practices in Lincolnshire. Only 1 was good. 2 were needs improvement, and 1 was inadequate. I find that rather worrying. It's clearly a downward trend. On the question that's been raised previously about digital tools being switched off, I have to say, I find the concept of a digital tool being switched off quite ludicrous. I've been using internet services on the internet for nearly 30 years now, I think, since the internet was created. I've never come across the concept of an organisation switching off its portal. It's frankly. So when I want to report a blood pressure reading on a Sunday night, I log into the portal so I can report it. I don't expect to hear until Monday morning, but I expect to be able to do it. And I expect to see a warning that says, by the way, no one's monitoring this today. It's a Sunday, for goodness sake. We'll look at it at some point tomorrow after 8 o'clock. That seems to me a perfectly normal, reasonable, logical, intelligent way of using IT, and I genuinely don't understand why the NHS can't do that. I also noticed from when I was just doing some research on this, I looked at NHS Digital. One of the things that is rich in the NHS is the amount of stats you can see on NHS Digital. And I would encourage, by the way, those people who write reports for us to put links into their reports to the relevant stats on NHS Digital, because there's far more there than would want to go into a report, but I think it would help members very much to see a lot of background, a lot of trends about what's happening, particularly if there's things of a statistical nature and performance management. So I noticed that for the latest figures for April, and I think this happens every month, but in April, the number of same-day appointments in Lincolnshire with a GP was 34,000 on a Thursday, but only 25,000 on a Friday, which means that 36% more appointments on a Thursday than on a Friday. And I'd obviously love to know why that is. It just seems rather strange. On the NHS, sorry, on the 8 a.m. rush problem, that you have to phone in at 8 o'clock, and also the issue that I know has happened elsewhere, that GPs were only allowing same-day appointments to be booked. I wonder why, and I'd love to know why, it took national government intervention, quite heavy-handed diktat from central government, to do something about this. I would expect that NHS being a national body that's organised locally, there would be enough local powers to try and sort these arrangements out without it requiring this very heavy top-down intervention by central government. And finally, on this question of GP appointments, again, if it's a telephone appointment and the person on the other end, the patient, is unable to take the call, does that still count as an appointment? And I would add the point that it's very frustrating when the number is blocked that has called you and you can't call it back, or the number doesn't answer. Again, it's very frustrating. Obviously, if more stuff is done online, can be done online, we don't need to ring up. Again, that would be helpful. So I appreciate your comments on those points. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just start with the CQC. The methodology that the CQC themselves use is that it's not a rolling programme of CQC visits, because obviously there was a period of time during COVID when they weren't doing the visits. So what they do is prioritise going to practices. They do a desktop review of information across the practices, and they prioritise the assessments where there are issues highlighted either via complaints or those areas. The feedback from those CQC reports reflect the fact that through that information gathering, they have highlighted that there's issues, and therefore they've followed that through in terms of an assessment and targeted recovery plan associated to all of those practices. I'm not sure what I can add in terms of the digital tools. I think we all recognise...
Can I just take you back, Sarah Jane, before
Yeah.
you sort of rush through the GP practice and CQC ratings? I think building onto what has been said by Councillor Cleaver is, because of exactly what you've just laid out and because of COVID, do you not feel that there are probably considerably lots more GP practices that are quite likely to end up being inspected and end up becoming inadequate as well, and then end up going into special measures? And I think also building onto it, how are you actually monitoring this? Because there's been a few that have fell through the radar recently.
So if I start with the end, our own quality team do local quality visits and work with practices to identify what is happening in their areas. And we do generally identify those practices similarly to the CQC where there are issues. So when you describe fall through, actually in all of those instances, our team have been working with that practice prior to the CQC coming in place. And we have a good mechanism in terms of both our quality team and my own team, who regularly connect in with practices, look at the information and feedback from patients, and also monitor the complaints, so that we are targeting those practices where we need support. That doesn't preclude the fact that when they have an assessment that the outcome is what the outcome is, but in all of the instances, actually the team have already been connected with those practices prior to that. In terms of the digital tools, I'm not sure. Sorry, did you want to come back?
Sorry, Sarah, well, just going back then, in which case, how many others are on your radar now at the moment in time?
So at this point in time, there are, I'll just think. So the practices that are identified by CQC, we have intense support teams in there already. There are 2 other practices that we are closely working with at this point in time.
Thank you.
In terms of, we'll get to the digital bit, as in, I'm not sure what I can add in terms of the feedback we've already given about it is a developmental. I absolutely recognise what you're describing, and there is considerable more work to do in terms of how we utilise digital tools to improve access. And as Nick has highlighted, that is one of the main focuses of the primary care recovery plan. In terms of why has it required a national, quite strong approach to that, I would say that in Lincolnshire, actually our practices have been working on a number of these issues already. And you can see that in terms of the level of appointment increase, and also their response in terms of multidisciplinary team, and also the uptake of the digital telephony particularly. That being said, the primary care, the GP contract is a national contract, and therefore the national contract framework is the vehicle by which the GPs, if you like, are governed to ensure that they are all consistently moving in that direction. Here in Lincolnshire, I think we really value the relationship between our general practices and the ICB, but some of the benefits of the national programme is the redirection of investment, is the prioritisation and of public communication, developing the NHS app, commissioning separately the community pharmacy, which wouldn't be something that we would be able to do. And I think Reid identified that primary-secondary care interface. It helps to focus everybody on the matter that will require a collective response. And again, the fact it's in a national contract, we will be monitored very closely regionally and at a national level, ensures that everybody is working to the same goals. So I think that's why the national framework, it doesn't preclude the work we're doing locally, and we've included in today's report the people plan, which is a very local plan, and so it complements what we're doing.
So, Jane, can I just come in on just to reiterate one point, which I think is really important from Councillor Cleaver, was just about the portals being switched off and understanding your point around other organisations. I think when we're talking about healthcare, clearly there's a safety issue there that we need to make sure is clear for patients. The last thing we want, and this is why usually tools are switched off when the general practice is not open and therefore doesn't have contracted hours to be open, is safety, patient safety. That's what we work to as number one. The last thing we want is a patient to submit something onto a portal that's left open over the weekend that's unmonitored, and that is a significant medical issue that needed addressing there and then by 999, A&E, etc. I can think of examples where I've seen ones when we initially started the program, when we first started with the digital consultation tools, where you could see that there was a potential issue for certain patients. What we want is patients to know when their practice is not open, which services to access. And there's a lot here, and it goes back to the patient education and empowering patients with their care, not just minor illness, but all their care needs, is that they access the right service at the right time, because sometimes patients, because they know their general practitioners and the team within their GP practice, they might think on a Sunday at 6 p.m, I'll put this mild chest pain that I've got on to ask my GP, and they'll pick it up in the morning. Now, that might be a little bit of indigestion or something that we can deal with, but it might not be. It might be the signs of a heart attack, and that needs assessing there and then. So there's a significant safety component to why some of these portals are switched off. Empowering patients, having these tools that are intelligent enough to help signpost patients is part of the work that we've already talked about today. But I just wanted to make sure that was clear. There's a safety issue that we're trying to protect patients with.
Okay, thank you. I've got Mr. Stanningland.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'll try and be brief. I'm interested in the impact of the 8 a.m. call same-day appointment system on a couple of groups of patients, and firstly would be those with mental health issues, and how easy is it for somebody with mental health issues to call a GP surgery at 8 a.m. and consistently call? I've had to call 20, 30 times to get through, and do we know whether those patients are actually achieving access? And the other is with patients that have a concern but perhaps not an immediate issue and an immediate severe health problem. They're perhaps concerned about a particular aspect of their health, and do we know what impact the system has on those patients? For example, are we discovering cancers at a later stage because people haven't pushed themselves forward in the morning rush because they think, well, my concern's not critical, and they're obviously very busy, And if so, what alternative pathways are there for those people that have sort of maybe not such immediate concerns, but but a minor, but could potentially be serious concerns?
Do you want me to come in, Sarah Jane?
I was just going to say, Reid, would you like to answer, because they seem
Yeah.
like clinical issues?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it goes back to a little bit about the work about the development of systems, and we've talked again the recovery program, the Accelerate program we've already talked about, and how workflow, we'll call it, or patient requests and everything else that general practice does flows through the practice to get to the right person at the right time and get the right outcome for that patient, be that an appointment with the GP or signposting to another service or colleague. I think in terms of non-urgent queries, I'll give you an example. So my practice, for example, we will turn off our digital tool at times if we reach a capacity that we think clinically is safe. And in the report I submitted, there's research around what is classed as safe number of appointments before the decision fatigue. And then after that period, if someone contacts us and the digital tool is off, then our reception team will take details. They won't make a clinical decision for that patient, but they will ask the patient if they feel it's urgent for the day or not. They will put that onto our clinical system, and then one of our GPs usually will look at that request. And what we may then do, and to be fair, forgive me, even with queries that come through when the digital tool is on, we will look at those and we will allocate whether they are urgent for the day, or from a general practitioner point of view or the clinician point of view, whether they can wait for tomorrow or be put to a non-urgent request list. So there's various different elements that a practice can use, and what we do is we feed back to patients that we've put this into the list. Let's say they were chasing up about blood tests. The blood test looked okay. X doctor will be with you when they're next back in on Tuesday or whenever it is. So giving some real-time feedback to those patients. In terms of, has there been any data in terms of delays to a diagnosis? I don't think there has been. I think actually there's more access. I know there's more demand, as we've talked about. There's more access, there's more appointments happening than there ever has been. Yes, there is more pathology, but we would actually think that we're getting to patients sooner in many ways than we might have done in traditional models. I think the one thing just to highlight is when the contract that came in years ago, the GMS contract, was modelled, it was for 4 appointments a year. And on average, we're looking at the average patient is having 9 to 10 appointments a year. So there's an awful lot of appointments happening with the average patient. Obviously, some people never go and some people go often. Mental health issues, I think it probably varies, doesn't it? Like a lot of health conditions in terms of the patient's ability, their comfort in contacting services, depending on what they are struggling with, whether they have someone who can support them with that. And then, yes, their digital literacy, their access to mobile phones, so on and so forth. Different practices have different mechanisms where vulnerable groups could get in contact with them, and sometimes palliative patients, patients with mental health difficulties, people we know have access issues in other ways. And practices build that based on their local population groups. So I think there's different models that work for the patients and the practices that those populations work around. I hope that kind of answers some of those points. I think, again, as the development of these tools come along and the development of workflow comes along, and less of the 8 a.m. rush, I think that will be clearer, and I think it will be the access will be more consistent across the day and the week for patients. I think what we just need to be aware of is if there is an awful lot more access and no more capacity, then that is still a pressure point for patients and practices. So again, going back to an early point, we need the resource, the manpower to address these requests for appointments.
Nick, you want to come in?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it was on the point around people with mental health issues accessing primary care, and I won't repeat repeat what Dr. Baker said, but one of the things we are looking at is how we support people with more severe mental illness to access primary care. And one of the bits of work we've done recently with GP practice, and I think it's really important to acknowledge the hard work that GP practice put in, is supporting people to have a health check with their GP each year. And we've seen the numbers increase significantly over the last couple of years. It's been a great piece of work, and it means that everybody with a more severe mental illness is going in to see their GP, see clinicians from their GP practice, and have a range of health checks carried out, some screening, and then they're referred onward into services. We're also doing some work this year to ensure that we're training primary care staff so they're more able to work in a personalised way with people with severe mental illness. So again, trying to support GP practices with that. So there's an ongoing piece of work around supporting people with more serious mental health issues, access GP practice, and also support GP practice staff to provide care to them. I think we do know that people with mental health issues probably do find it harder to access services generally, not just GP practice, but services generally. And that's something that we will be looking at and working with colleagues who work on something called the Health Inequalities Programme. So they're looking at the range of patients that maybe aren't able to access services for a range of reasons, and look to see what we can do about that. So it's definitely on our agenda and something we'll be working on. But again, just want to reiterate, GP practice have been doing some fantastic work bringing people with severe mental illness in to carry out health checks over this last couple of years.
Okay, thank you. I've now got Councillor Smith, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I will make a brief point on the Ask My GP front. Certainly in the case of my surgery, it isn't a choice. You're forced to use it. And when it was down through a technical reason and a resident rang up, the exact words from the receptionist were, "I know it's down, use it anyway," which is about as much help as a chocolate teacup. Chairman, I think the biggest problem, and Sarah Jane touched on it, and so did Councillor Allen, I think one of the biggest problems is you don't know your GP anymore. When I was a boy, you had and this goes back a while, I appreciate I'm 29, this goes back a while, you had a family doctor, and they genuinely were your family doctor, and you knew them, and they knew you. So no matter how embarrassing the problem may have been, if you needed to see them, you'd see them because they knew you, they knew the family. I haven't got any data to back this up, Chairman, but I am pretty sure since things like Ask My GP came in, the amount of people say, "Oh, it's not that serious, I've got work, I can't come out of work, I'll do it another time," and then it gets serious. I know because I did it myself, Chairman, before COVID, as you know. And it does happen. I can't prove that with statistical data. I haven't gone around with a pen and ticked it off, but I'm pretty sure it happens. It's also, I think there's an element of, not ignorance, but it's lack of understanding, because when the GP says to me, "I'll phone you back," that's great. But if I happen to be in the wrong part of my house and not in my bedroom, which is the only place that gets a signal, and even that's poor, you can't phone me back because I'm not going to be able to hear you. So when somebody, or when you say, "Oh, please don't ring me between X time because I'm actually somewhere where I actually can't pick a phone up," you still get phoned at X time. So the doctor's wasted their time and you're wasting yours as well. But on to the main point, Chairman, I think the biggest problem, and people aren't going to like this, is a former colleague, Mike Thompson, who was a GP, was here. And as he said, when he was a GP, he did call out, he worked weekends, and I can remember being able to see a GP on a Saturday, not a Sunday because they did away with that, but I can remember seeing a GP on a Saturday, and that's gone. And ever since that changed, and I can't, haven't got the data, but ever since that changed, the public perception and things that residents say to me is, ever since that changed, we've had problems and we can't see our GP. And going through either Ask My GP or a receptionist, it's a bit like trying to go through a gate guard. You've got to answer 20 million questions when you know in your own body something's wrong. I need to see the GP. Very few people will think, "Oh, as has been alluded to." I would be very surprised if people went more than twice a year. And some, like myself, you go even less unless you're in a lot of pain because you don't like seeing doctors. And it's so difficult now, Chairman, and it's so frustrating. So residents, which is what I said to EMAS, they get to the point where actually they become poorly, very poorly, because they think it's so difficult to see the GP. I'll wait. I'll go to the emergency walk-in centre if there is one. If you haven't got one, I'll wait some more, it'll go. I'll get some medication over the counter and it'll go away. It doesn't go away. And then second tier care gets called and then they're stretched. And until we sort this problem, Chairman, it's going to keep happening. And nothing in that report to me says that problem's going to get fixed by what's in there.
I think there are different challenges that you highlight. There is no doubt that the demand that general practice is under is constraining their ability to respond to everybody's needs. You're absolutely right. The model of general practice has changed quite substantially over the last number of years, and that increasingly you've got that multidisciplinary team. There are strengths to that, but there are also some limitations in that model. And one of the things I think Dr. Baker alluded to earlier is about how do we make sure that the people who really need to see the GP get straight to the GP. The vulnerable, Nick mentioned people with mental illness, palliative and end-of-life care patients, frail elderly. How do we develop the mechanisms to make sure that they get through to the right people first time? And I think GP colleagues locally, patients and nationally would all highlight the fact that in responding to increased demand, we have lost some of that continuity and that relationship. And this is the thing that trying to address that demand issue is intended to then release that capacity to reconnect people to clinicians where they have that continuity of a relationship. It's not just with general practice, though, in terms of that ongoing relationship, particularly for people with a long-term condition or other needs. And a lot of the work that is happening in parallel is how do we move to a way of working that is more proactive and helps people identify and get the support they need sooner so that they don't go into crisis. And that, again, is a big cultural change and links back to some of the points that Pete was highlighting in the joint forward plan. So how do we help people understand their long-term condition, notice a change and make contact at that point in time, and what's the mechanisms we have to support people. We've got some great examples in Lincolnshire. They're not uniform, but we have got some great examples of developing teams. We call them care coordinators, but they are people who work alongside patients, particularly the frail elderly, where they need that consistent relationship with somebody to check things out. Because you're absolutely right, a lot of people will go, I won't bother the GP because they're too busy. But if they feel that they've got a point of contact where they can check things out, that enables us then to direct them much quicker into the right people, and we can see evidence that that's working, and that's a big emphasis in terms of the living well and helping people manage their own health and be proactive in addressing that.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that? Sorry,
carry on, Dr.
Chair. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I think it's important points made. I think by both Councillor Smith and by Sarah Jane. I think times have changed. I think, as we said, there's a wider team within general practice, and I think the job has changed. You know, what if you ask general practitioners what they love about general practice? It's knowing their patients. It's from birth to death, caring for them, and knowing as soon as they walk in the door whether they look right or she doesn't look like she normally does. There's something wrong here, and you've got that intuition, that feel, but the changing landscape of demand, more patients, and older, more medically complex population, as well as I talked about the one-off episodes of care for younger people, has stretched the workforce that we know is significantly challenged, even with the great support we've had from all the other colleagues we talked about earlier that we brought into general practice. But fundamentally, you would probably know your GP better if the pressures that were there, both those financial and demand pressures, and that continuity of care was there in general practice. So if we had a significantly larger GP and allied workforce within general practice nationally, but particularly in Lincolnshire, and we had that time to spend with each patient, and we had that relationship, you would find that the patients would be more satisfied and general practitioners would be more satisfied. That is not the direction of travel of developments in the system because of the pressures nationally, financially, and on workforce. But we would agree that that continuity is crucial. So you knowing your GP is crucial. I would go back to the point you made about, you know, you'd be surprised if people had more than 1 or 2 appointments a year. We can see in the data, I've done it in my own practice, it's 9 or 10 appointments on average. And there may be people like your good self that don't go very often, but there are people who go very often because they have complex needs, or they're concerned about certain illnesses. So it is a significant strain, and you may not see that in terms of the number of appointments from an outward perspective. But I think all practices would echo that volume of demand. The other thing that's pulled us away is there was traditionally, it was the GP would see a patient and that would be it. The increase in bureaucracy we've touched upon already, that either would be part of core general practice paperwork or is additional due to the interface we talked about with primary and secondary care, has taken time facing patients away from general practice. And that's something we'd rather be seeing patients than doing paperwork, unless it's of significant benefit to that patient that's sat in front of you. So a little bit of context there in terms of what's pulled us away from continuity of care that we used to see traditionally.
Yeah, very briefly, I'm just conscious we're at 1 already.
Thank you, Chairman. What can be done so that you are spending less time with, as you say, paperwork you don't want to spend time with, so you can do the job you want to do? And I accept, even in my short time, that I've seen an increase in the amount of paperwork a GP's got to do. So what can, is there anything we can do to help you say to people on high or whoever needs to be said to that actually this paperwork isn't really necessary, it's a tick box, leave it, you know, it doesn't need to be done, I need to do this piece of paperwork for the patient, then I need to see my next patient?
Yeah, I think, as we've already talked about, that interface between primary and secondary care, there's a lot of paperwork that goes on around that. And actually, as we talked about, releasing that capacity would really help us in terms of providing services and appointments directly to patients that need them in general practice. So your support as part of the wider recovery programme would be really, really useful to make sure that that interface is working well, and that capacity can then be released for general practice. There are lots of things that go on in each and every practice that, from a paperwork perspective, that are there are clearly important things that happen from a safety point of view and some assurance things, but there's an increasing amount of paperwork without a clear direct patient benefit. So I think whenever there's any initiatives nationally, I think what we'd like from yourselves and people nationally is that support, that is there a direct patient benefit here, or would the GP be better sat in front of a patient seeing somebody rather than completing this? Because that's the key for it all. On average, you know, I might be sat in my practice for 12 hours on a clinical day, and actually a significant portion of that is not sat in front of a patient or dealing with their direct request. It's other things around patient management or even practice management as well.
Okay, thank you. I've got Jill Mackinson-Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, this is a real grumble from me. I really want to believe what you're saying, Sarah Jane. I just can't believe it. And if I had £1 for every complaint I get about the practice that I am a member of in Louth, I would be an extremely wealthy woman. I can tell you about, I unfortunately got shingles in November, and I can assure you everything that could go wrong with my journey, with supposedly my practice, which I've been to since before I was born, which I've been a patient of since before I was born, has been absolutely hopeless. And I completely agree with the gentleman over there. Everything, it just, from a patient point of view, the system isn't working. I ended up going to urgent care. They were absolutely wonderful. They couldn't have been more helpful. I had to go back because then I got an infection in one of the shingles bumps or spots or whatever they are. Absolutely wonderful. Yet again, I ended up going to see a community pharmacist in the new year because I was in such pain. He said, go home, phone 111. I phoned 111. I got a lovely lady who phoned me back later in the day. She was a pain specialist nurse with over 20 years experience. She told me exactly what I should go back to the doctor's surgery and ask for. I went back there, having written it diligently down, and I follow exactly what you say about being educated on all of this. I went back with all of this, and the woman said, "Oh, I think that's..." the nurse that I saw was blooming useless, and said, "Well, yes, but that seems a bit drastic, doesn't it? Here we are. Here's 100 paracetamols." And I thought, oh, I could go home and commit suicide with that, really, couldn't I? And the whole scheme, even wanting to have the jab to stop me having it so badly, I am now left in a vast amount of pain. I'm not taking any painkillers because I can't be bothered to, because it's absolutely stupid. I don't want to have to take something to stop my stomach bleeding so I can take a painkiller. Ridiculous. I want to look after myself, but the health service isn't enabling me to look after myself properly. I just feel so frustrated. And I want to believe what you're telling me, but it isn't working. It isn't working for the patient. And having seen it myself and had to endure it, I think it's not what I think I've paid for an NHS. I'm sorry, but, I'm sorry, you have to do better to persuade me that you are seeing more people, you are doing things better. You've turned us all into the worried well as well, which probably has meant more people are coming to see you. I just feel really sad about how things have gone.
No, I mean, I think that colleagues, I mean, I'm looking at Dr. Baker here, I think that colleagues would recognise what you're saying, that this isn't just a sort of like concern from patients, it's a concern from professionals about the fact that people too often are having your type of experience, and that's why it isn't just a case of we can wave a magic wand and put in a new telephone system, or we can bring in an extra physio. It is a fundamental change in how we deliver the services, and I think that will not happen overnight. It will be really, really important that we help people understand the different service offers, utilise those appropriately, and absolutely make sure that somebody like yourself in the situation you find, you get straight to the person. We are not there yet, and that is why both locally and nationally the recovery plan has been developed. But, in presenting the recovery plan, everybody's said this isn't a magic bullet that will fix everything. This is the start of I suppose, a change in how we approach improving and trying to make it more systematic. Because, I'm sure Dr. Baker would absolutely concur. That's not the service our GPs want to provide. It's not the service our patients. And that's why we have, at the other end, GP colleagues looking to retire because they're not getting the job satisfaction. So I don't think anybody is saying it is working, but it does require a fundamental change that enables somebody like yourself to get to the right person first time, and currently we don't have that.
And it would be quite useful if we could actually report that back without thinking I'm going to get slung off the list of the GPs, because I think it's important that they understand what as a service user, how the effect it has on us as well.
And because I spend quite a lot of my time with GB colleagues, I think unfortunately it often is presented as a criticism of the individuals rather than the fact that the service model needs to change. And this isn't something that my GPs, Dr. Baker's himself said, areas that he personally would want to see improve. And I think recognising it's a service model rather than an individual is very, very different.
Okay, thank you.
If I can just come on.
Yeah, come on.
We got time for it. Thanks, Carl. Sorry, can't quite tell. So firstly, apologies to hear he had shingles, and I wouldn't want anybody to have that terribly painful for a lot of people. I think Sarah Jane's points are very, very valid. For me, I'm very interested in detail, and the context behind why that pathway was, or that experience for you was as it was, is really key for me. I think thankfully the majority of interactions aren't reflective of yours, but when they happen, and they do happen, we appreciate that across practices. Why? I think quite right about the feedback, and Sarah Jane's quite right. It can feel very personal to the individuals involved, where it is a system issue, which is caused by the things we've alluded to in terms of pressure on workforce demand, complexity of patients, etc. If we had lots more colleagues working in practices and lots of other systems in place, those experiences should be an almost never event rather than them happening to your good self. So I think it is reflective of the system problems. And none of those people probably involved in your care that day wanted you to have that experience, or set out that day to think, I'm not going to treat that patient as I would want to. And that is why the job satisfaction is down for many colleagues, because there's a service they want to provide, but the environment and the circumstances are not supportive of that, and that's at the detriment of patients at times. So that's why we, as I said, we should all be supporting further resources we talked about into general practice in the wider NHS, so that we can give you that good experience when, heaven forbids, you do have shingles or something similar in the future.
If I could just come back and say one thing. I was under the impression that the lady who helped me from 111, who was absolutely brilliant, somebody would take notice of her. And I don't know what the interaction is between 111 and the GP surgery. And I'm a bit mystified by that. Perhaps you could explain it.
Yeah, I think it can be a challenge. So often a patient will contact myself at our surgery, and they'll say they've spoken to 111, over the weekend, for example, or earlier that morning, and there's not necessarily anything in the clinical record at that point in time. So we don't know what you've talked about, what the symptoms you gave them were, what their thoughts were, what their advice was, or what their diagnosis was. So we can be working without information that's helpful to you and to us. So sometimes there is nothing is the answer to your question. We might then see 24 hours later that something appears in the record, but it might not be fully expansive on the discussion that you had. So again, this is all part of there being better flow of information throughout the NHS, which will improve your patient journey.
Okay, thank you. I've just got two questions, if I might, and that is on page 44, the report states that due to increased costs, practices are looking to halt recruitment or making staff redundant. So can I ask what the LMC, BMA and ICB are doing to ensure that this is avoidable, especially when funding such as the ARRS is not being utilised due to recruitment issues?
I don't know if you want to start, Sarah Jane, or you'd like me to?
Yes. I suppose starting with the R's roles, so we've got a targeted piece of work that we're doing to make sure that we make the most of those. So at the moment, we are projected to be able to recruit to all of the opportunities within that. But obviously, as soon as somebody joins, sometimes you have the turnover. But there is a very, very detailed plan. And working with colleagues from the primary care network and my own team, we're working with different organisations so that we can really explore the opportunities to recruit to those different professional groups. And we've got a number of roles where we've got people in training as we speak. So GP assistants, for example, there are, I think it's 10 currently in training. So there's very detailed plans about how we do that. The financial pressures are a reality for everybody. And as a ICB, we're working hard to make sure that practices are supported to maximise the income that they can get through the contract. And I think some of the points that Nick was alluding to earlier around the SMI health checks, for example, is about making sure that we support practices to get people to go to their practice to have those health checks, because that will help in terms of very complex funding arrangements that general practice have. They have different income streams. So we're working on that. In practices that contact us or via the LMC we become aware of that are financially really struggling and are at risk of falling over, for a non-technical term, we actually work very closely with them to look at what support we can provide from an ICB perspective, both in the short term and the medium term. There may be some short-term additional support. In some instances, that will be financial, but under a contractual arrangement. But more often than not, it's about how we support the practices to adopt some of the things that will make them more efficient that perhaps they haven't used. And again, that's the accelerator programme. So there's a lot of work that's going on in terms of actually supporting individual practices. And then finally, making sure that any development opportunities that we've got, such as the funding through the primary care recovery plan, we get that, and that is fully committed to support general practice up front. So that everybody knows that that income is coming, and we do try and do that in a bureaucracy light. Dr. Baker might not agree that it's always as light as he would like, but bureaucracy light, so that we've got good stewardship, but we can get the funding to the practices.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Sarah Jane. In terms of from an LMC perspective, what we're doing, I think the first thing I would say is actually we shouldn't really even be having to have this conversation about practice having to look at pausing recruitment or redundancy. General practice is the bedrock of the NHS, and that's, we need that support centrally and nationally, so that we've got successful general practice to help every other part of the NHS and social care system and voluntary sector as well. So that needs to change nationally, I think, is one thing. And from the LMC perspective, we are on national forums and communicate directly with GPC as part of BMA for the challenges that we're facing in Lincolnshire, and the current acting chair of GPC England is a GP in Lincolnshire, so they are more than aware of the challenges we're facing. In the region itself, I mean, we've had a lot of conversations, Sarah Jane and her colleagues in the ICB. As an LMC, we've raised how we can bring more funding into general practice to support the core functions and any other service development that might be on the horizon or currently being developed. We need that core stability, though, because otherwise, as I said in my summary and report, we risk the viability of practices and those things that we just said. We are trying to support practices with our practice support team at the LMC. So if there is a need identified, be that financial or operational, one of our team members or more than one of our team members will go in and support that practice, be that efficiency measures or be that pastoral support and helping those practices through difficult times, because the colleagues in practice, in general practice, are struggling, they are stressed, and sometimes they need that support. So there's a lot going on with retention, recruitment, but ultimately we need a national injection, sustained injection in NHS and particularly general practice to ensure success going forward.
Thank you. And I have a question which I think perhaps you could bring along when we next have you back. But on page 46, the previous comments of the committee wishing to see an increase in face-to-face appointments undertaken by GPs has been taken on board, which I totally welcome. However, we have some comparisons to 2019 in the report. So do you have any information on how many face-to-face appointments were conducted by GPs as opposed to other healthcare staff in 2019?
I don't have it to hand, but we will have data in terms of face-to-face appointments.
Yeah, I think on the next update, if you could bring that along, because I have a sneaking suspicion it'll probably be much higher. So thank you. In which case, I'm going to move to a proposal that we thank the representatives from the Lincolnshire Integrated Local Medical Committee, and the NHS Lincolnshire Integrated Care Board for attending the presentation. I'd also like to welcome the 43% increase in the number of appointments in GP practices between 2019 and 2023, and to support any further measures to enhance access to GP services, such as improved recruitment and retention, and access to funding for additional roles in GP practices. And finally, to seek an update after a period of 6 months. Do I have a seconder for my proposal? Thank you, Councillor Smith. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. That's supported unanimously, in which case I'd just like to thank you all very much for your presentation. We'll see you again soon. So that brings the meeting to a close. Apologies for the lateness, but there was a lot on the agenda today. Thank you.